4, 3, 2, 1. Committee will come to order. And before we begin, I want to first yield to the ranking member to introduce our two new members. Is the ranking member with us, Dr. Fox?
Yes,
Oh, I'm
sir.
sorry.
I am here. We only have one of our new ranking members with us. The other one is not here right now, but we're very pleased to have Mr. Sempolinsky with us. He was sworn in last night, and he made a wonderful speech on the floor about what an honor it is to be in the House of Representatives, and I certainly share his opinion. I don't believe Mr. Finstead's with us yet, and we'll be happy to introduce him at the next opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much. And I also want to thank the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli, of New York's 25th Congressional District, for his service on the Education and Labor Committee. He will be regrettably leaving us for what he thinks is a better committee, the Appropriations Committee. And while we know that members there will benefit from the same thoughtfulness, dedication, which he approaches his duties in Congress and on this committee, he'll be sorely missed right here. Joe, your contributions over the years with children, workers, and families, and the good work on the on legislation and healthcare will be very much missed. But we know you're going to continue, and when we need appropriations, we know who to look to. I know you'll still be there doing good work on that committee. So, Mr. Morelli, thank you so much for your service. As this hearing, we'll begin the hearing 1 week and a half after the nation celebrated Labor Day. The committee is meeting today to discuss the growing popularity of unions among American people and the steps Congress must take to ensure every worker has an opportunity to reap the benefits of joining a union. Some of our nation's greatest advances were made because of the labor movement. Decades ago, the labor movement created the 40-hour work week, curbed dangerous child labor practices, and ensured that workers had a bare minimum wage. Today, unions continue to press employers to secure livable wages, better benefits, and safer workplaces for America's workers. On average, a worker covered by a collective bargaining agreement earns more than 10% more in wages than a peer with similar education, occupation, and experience in a non-union workplace in the same sector. The private sector workers covered by union contracts are 27% more likely to be offered health insurance through their employer. And data also show that unions close the racial and gender gaps by creating an engine of economic mobility for workers, because under a union contract, everyone gets equal pay for equal work. Ultimately, the labor movement built the middle class by giving the workers a voice on the job. And as such, there should be no surprise that unions are popular among American people. In fact, according to a recent Gallup poll, more than 70% of the American people approve of unions, the highest approval rate since 1965. This is a direct result of Americans rejecting practices made worse during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. As we know, too many workers were forced to endure unsafe working conditions. And now, as we've seen workers do time and time again, workers are turning to unions to help secure safer workplaces, livable wages, and opportunities for promotion. According to the National Labor Relations Board, or the NLRB, demand for union representation increased by nearly 60% in the first 3 quarters of 2022 compared to the same period last year. And importantly, unions won 641 elections in the first half of 2022, almost double the victories in all of 2021. The spike in labor organizing is in part due to several high-profile victories among organizers that Starbucks, Amazon, Apple, and Trader Joe's. And while the organizers in these campaigns were victorious, they and many others have been met with a slew of unfair labor practices and serious obstacles to reaching the first collective bargaining agreement. Just recently, the National Labor Relations Board found over 200 violations of the National Labor Relations Act, or the NLRA, at Starbucks locations in Buffalo, New York alone. Violations included firing organizers, closing stores, reducing compensation, and surveilling workers' organizing activities. The anti-union campaigns conducted by Starbucks represents a growing trend. For example, for decades, unscrupulous employers have eroded unions by taking advantages of the weaknesses in the NLRA. Just between 2016 and 2021, 87% of employers conducted anti-union campaigns during union elections, even though the choice of organizing is up to the employee and the employer is never on the ballot. And while the NLRB facilitates union elections and investigates violations, the agency has been put on its back foot with low staffing levels and flat funding. Since 2014, the agency's budget has remained consistent, which, accounting for inflation, amounts to a 25% decrease in funding since fiscal year 2010. This is yet another barrier to supporting workers and holding employers accountable. In response to anti-union campaigns and weaknesses in the NLRA, House Democrats have twice passed the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or the PRO Act. PRO Act is the most significant upgrade in U.S. labor law in nearly 80 years. Specifically, this legislation sets meaningful penalties for employers who violate workers' rights, requires workers whose rights have been violated to be temporarily reinstated while their cases are pending, and ensures that unions can collect a fair share of dues from all workers who are obligated to represent for their representational obligations. And that does not mean the political activities or the holiday party or the summer cookout, just what you are legally obligated to perform. I also remain committed to working with my colleagues in the Biden-Harris administration to provide the NLRB with the funding it needs to protect workers' rights to organize. And while I'm encouraged that the House Labor H appropriations includes $319 million for the NLRB, a $45 million increase over its current budget, it is imperative that this increase be actually enacted. The surge in organizing requires an urgent response from Congress and the administration, and the response is to end the funding crisis that has left the agency straining under the weight of new caseloads. The history has shown us that when we invest in workers, we build the economy from the bottom up and the middle out. And so I look forward to delivering on that goal and ensuring that joining a union will be a right and not a fight. With that, I yield to the distinguished ranking member, Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Despite Democrats' aggressive attempts to force union representation on workers, Republicans are committed to ensuring workers have the freedom to choose whether they want to join a union. I'd like to remind my colleagues that federal law already protects the right of employees to organize or to refrain from doing so. Any reforms to our labor laws should help workers and spur economic growth, not exclusively promote the interests of union bosses. There's a reason why the PRO Act cannot clear the Senate. It is a deeply unpopular bill that undermines basic, long-standing worker rights and would take a wrecking ball to Main Street. Republicans just want fair and neutral labor laws. Instead of working together to create a level playing field, Democrats want to pass a union wish list bill to build on what they claim is a historic surge in unionizing. But Democrats are cherry-picking data to sell the narrative that unions are on the rise. For example, Democrats will likely point out that Workers United has unionized more than 200 Starbucks locations, but they will fail to mention this is less than 3% of the company's more than 9,000 wholly owned stores. Also not on the list of Democrat talking points is that only 1 out of 270 Apple stores have voted to unionize. They will also probably ignore the fact that the private sector union membership rate is the lowest it's ever been. Bottom line, Democrat claims that interest in unionization is on the rise is another drummed-up narrative by the left-wing media and Democrat politicians. If unions want to know why they do not appeal to workers, they need to take a long, hard look in the mirror. Most unions spend a significant amount of their money on radical political activity, not advocating for workers. Further, union corruption has been a major issue which previous administrations worked hard to tackle. Yet Democrats who are in the pocket of big labor continue to resist transparency measures that would keep workers informed on how their union dues are being spent. Unions are relying on the Biden administration to twist the arms of workers into unionizing. President Biden, who promised to have the most pro-union administration in history, is complying. He established a task force on worker organizing and empowerment to mobilize all federal agencies in his crusade to unionize as many workers as possible. Many federal departments are taking this mandate seriously, especially the Department of Labor. For example, Labor Secretary Marty Walsh, a former union boss, marched in a picket line at a Kellogg's plant in Lancaster, Pennsylvania last October. Mr. Walsh apparently forgot that he's supposed to promote the interest of all workers, not act as an activist on behalf of unions. Perhaps most egregious, the Biden administration is working to implement provisions of the PRO Act by executive fiat. The radical Pro-Union Bosses Act would ban right-to-work laws, forcing workers to pay union dues, even if they object to union representation. If the Democrats had their way, free choice would be a thing of the past in the American workforce. It would also, among other things, undermine the independent contractor and franchise models by codifying the Obama-era job-killing joint employer standard and California's disastrous ABC test. To make matters worse for the job creators and workers, the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, is being used as the litigation arm of big labor. Instead of promoting fair labor practices, the NLRB is exhuming decades-old policies like the Joy Silk Doctrine, which would allow unions to organize a workplace without ever receiving majority support in a secret ballot election. Replacing the secret ballot with a card check system would open the door for intimidation and coercion of workers. The Biden-appointed NLRB General Counsel is also challenging long-standing precedent regarding employers' rights to educate workers on the downside of union representation. This would dramatically infringe on an employer's freedom of speech and deprive workers of hearing both sides of the argument regarding unionization. But to Democrats, there's only one choice: unionize or bust. Additionally, the NLRB has yet to answer for its alleged collusion with Workers United during a recent Starbucks union election. According to an NLRB whistleblower, certain NLRB officials colluded with agents of Workers United to arrange for unobserved in-person voting in NLRB offices during NLRB-ordered mail ballot elections. NLRB officials also shared voting data with Workers United to increase turnout among pro-union employees. Republicans will continue to demand answers and accountability from the NLRB, and I encourage my Democrat colleagues to do the same. Democrats are beholden to union bosses. Unions send huge portions of their worker-funded war chests to Democrat political organizations, campaigns, and left-wing organizations. It's no wonder Democrats kowtow to union bosses. Yet being pro-union does not mean being pro-worker. And in too many instances, workers and job creators are being harmed by unions. Republicans will continue to stand for a worker's right to choose. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to remind the members that this is a hybrid hearing pursuant to House Resolution 8 and the regulations there too. All microphones, both in the room and on the platform, will be kept muted as a general rule to avoid unnecessary background noise. Members and witnesses will be responsible for unmuting themselves when they recognize the speaker, when they wish to seek recognition. When members wish to speak or seek recognition, they should unmute themselves and allow for a pause of 2 seconds to ensure the microphone picks up their speech. I've also asked that members identify themselves before they speak. Members who are participating in person should not be logged onto the remote platform in order to avoid feedback, echoes, and distortion. Members participating remotely will be considered present in the proceeding when they are visible on camera, and be considered not present when they're not visible on camera. The only exception is if you're experiencing technical difficulty and inform the staff, committee staff of such difficulty. If you are experiencing technical difficulty during the hearing, you should stay connected on the platform and make sure you're muted, and use your phone to immediately contact the committee's IT director, whose number was provided in advance. And should the chair need to step away for any reason, another majority member is hereby authorized to assume the gavel in the chair's absence. In order to ensure the committee's 5-minute rule is adhered to, staff will be keeping track of time using the committee's digital timer on the remote platform. For members participating in person, the timer will be broadcast in the committee room on the television monitor as part of the platform gallery view and visible in its own thumbnail window. The committee room timer will not be in use. For members participating remotely, this will be visible in gallery view in its own thumbnail window on the remote platform. Members are asked to wrap up promptly when your time has expired. Finally, the recent guidance from the Office of Attending Physician has made mask wearing optional at this time, but please know that there are people who are immunocompromised, so you should take their situation in consideration. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, opening statements are limited to the chair and the ranking member. And so those statements have been made, and without objection, all other members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. on September 28th. Hopefully in Microsoft Word format. We will now hear from our witnesses. Dr. Kate Bronfenbrenner is the Senior Lecturer and Director of Labor Education Research at the Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations. Mark Gaston Pierce is the former chairman. Gaston Pierce is the former chairman of the National Labor Relations Board and executive director and visiting professor at Georgetown Law Center's Workers' Rights Institute. Mr. G. Roger King is the Senior Labor Employment Counsel for the HR Policy Association. And Ms. Michelle Eisen is a barista at Starbucks at their Elmwood Avenue location in Buffalo, New York. And we appreciate the witnesses for participating today, and we look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that your statements will appear in full in the hearing record pursuant to Committee Rule 8D and the committee practice. Each of you is asked to limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. Before you begin your testimony, please remember to unmute your microphone. During your testimony, staff will be keeping track of time, and the timer will be visible at the witness table. Please be attentive to time and wrap up when your time is over, and then mute the microphone. We'll let all of the witnesses make their presentations before we move to member questions. When answering a question, please remember to unmute your microphone. Witnesses are aware of their responsibility to provide accurate information to the community, and therefore we'll proceed directly to their testimony. We'll first recognize Dr. Bronfenbrenner. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Fox, and members of the committee for this opportunity to testify before you today about the current wave of union organizing and employer opposition. The findings I present today are the latest in a series of studies I've done over the last 30 years on employer opposition and to organizing under the National Labor Relations Act. These studies have found that the majority of employers engage in aggressive opposition to organizing, including coercive and retaliatory practices such as threats of plant closure, interrogation, discharge, bribes, discipline, harassment, and surveillance. And employer opposition has grown in intensity and sophistication over time as companies have globalized and restructured and gained access to new tools to monitor and surveil their workers. As already was mentioned, this is a pivotal moment for worker organizing. In the first half of fiscal year 2022, unions won 77% of elections, more than any year since 2000, and have organized twice as many workers in the first 6 months of this year as they did in the first 6 months of 2021. New workers, previously seen as unorganizable, are organizing in retail, nonprofits, communications, IT, such as Starbucks, Amazon, Trader Joe's, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Audubon Society, the New York Times, and Activision. Public approval is at the highest it's been since 1965 at 71%. And the majority of workers say they would vote for a union if given the opportunity. Yet, union density remains at 6.1% in the private sector and 10.3% overall. US employers have spent decades perfecting an anti-union strategy that works. So much so that unions are shifting their organizing away from traditional sectors of manufacturing, construction, and transportation to front-facing industries and firms in service, retail, and communications, where more coercive and retaliatory tactics may backfire. They're choosing tactics where they have the power to restrain, choosing targets where they have the power to restrain employer campaign, so much so that in 13% of the sample, employers did not run any campaign at all, primarily because neutrality agreements were negotiated. While employers may adjust the permutation and combination of tactics that they use, its essential elements remain the same. Our data show that 74% use management consultants, 85% use captive audience meetings, 71% use supervisor one-on-ones, 44% interrogate, 32% threaten, 45% engage in plant closing threats, 49% promote union activists out of the unit, and 16% discharge union activists, 23% engage in bribes, and 36% use surveillance. This doesn't stop at the end with the election. Employer opposition continues to the first contract campaign, so that only 38% have a first contract within a year, and a third still don't have a contract 3 years after the election. For all of these reasons, it is imperative that there be labor law reform. Most important is full funding for the NLRB. With the surge of elections and a 16% increase in unfair labor practices, the National Labor Relations Board is stretched to the absolute bare bones. When they're delayed, when they don't have resources, workers have a delay in their ability to organize. Second, there must be the passage of the PRO Act and all its components, including outlawing captive audience meetings where the intimidation and coercion occurs, establishing punitive penalties for labor law violations with super compounding penalties for multiple labor law violators, enforce first contract arbitration where parties are unable to negotiate a first agreement, authorize card check certification, and provide for automatic certification and bargaining order in cases where there are multiple serious unfair labor practices. Absent these kind of changes, workers will not be able to exercise their rights to organize and collective bargaining under the Act, which has an adverse effect on our entire society. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Pierce.
Thank you, Chairman Scott. and Ranking Member Fox for the opportunity to testify before you today at this hearing in solidarity, removing barriers to organizing. This is a special privilege for me, having spent practically half my 43-year career with the National Labor Relations Board, first as a lawyer, then ultimately as a board member and chairman. The National Labor Relations Board is the agency charged with enforcing the foremost labor law in the country, the National Labor Relations Act. And the Act, because of its inadequacy and its remedies, inferior remedies, and other enforcement mechanisms, has become regrettably inadequate to deal with the labor relations issues of today. Compounded with that is the inadequate funding that this agency has been given in order to effectively do its job. The National Labor Relations Act has among its fundamental purposes the encouragement of collective bargaining and the protection of workers' rights to organize. The NLRA, has also known as the Wagner Act, was passed by Congress in 1935 out of recognition of workers' rights, that workers' rights were fundamental rights. And despite its many flaws, the National Labor Relations Act was the first law to provide these protections, even with the exclusion of agricultural and domestic workers, the majority of whom were people of color. The substantial decrease in union density that we have experienced over time, which as compared to the 1/3 of the workforce that we experienced in mid-40s, has resulted in a vast inequality of labor and wealth in this country. With union density, while union density has yet to show signs of improvement, perceptions and reception has decidedly changed. Last month, a Gallup poll, as was indicated in prior testimony, shows 71% of Americans now approve of labor unions. These numbers are up from 64% before the pandemic, and is the highest Gallup has recorded since 1965. There are many reasons for this, and I'll just mention a few that I think are most significant. During the pandemic, corporations profited exponentially while workers were left behind. The shareholders of 22 of the nation's best-known companies employed more than 7 million frontline workers in sectors spanning retail, delivery, fast food, hotels, entertainment. It grew by $1.5 million, and it made the shareholders that rich, while 7 million workers received additional pay equaling less than 2% of the shareholders' gain. More than half of these workers were non-white. The pandemic exposed workers' vulnerability and corporate insensitivity. Various industries like computer chip manufacturers, fast food, and medical services experienced guidelines and directives that weaken protections for frontline workers during the height of the pandemic. However, it is the meatpacking industry that is the prime example. 59,000 workers at 5 of the companies controlling the lion's share of U.S. meat market were infected by the coronavirus. During the pandemic's first year, at least 269 workers across these meatpacking companies died of coronavirus between February and March of 2020. Deaths in a workplace that is made up of over 50% immigrants. The previous administration's failure to provide essential workers with basic protections during the coronavirus pandemic has underscored the importance of unions. The United Food and Commercial Workers secured increased pay and benefits for workers for more than a dozen meat packing and food processing companies, as well as premium pay for thousands of grocery store employees. The UAW persuaded General Motors, Ford, and Fiat Chrysler to shut down operations for 2 weeks to slow the spread of the virus. And they negotiated that the companies provide all workers with protective gear, including masks. And let's not forget the Communications Workers of America, which secured additional paid sick and family leave for unionized Verizon workers, including 26 weeks of paid sick leave for those diagnosed with COVID-19 and 8 weeks of paid leave for those caring for individuals medically diagnosed with that disease.
Mr. Pierce, your time is just about over.
Okay. Well, if I could end by saying this. Everything doesn't have to be that way. The Microsoft approach is indicative of that. They've had they have an agreement for card check recognition and giving the employees the opportunity to make free choice unencumbered by employer influences. I thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. King.
Chairman Scott, best of health to you. Nice to be with you again, albeit by a virtual connection this morning. Ranking Member Fox, Dr. Fox, great to see you. Great to be with you again. And new members of the committee, welcome. I'm appearing here this morning not in my capacity as Senior Labor and Employment Counsel of the HR Policy Association. Timing just didn't permit me to vet testimony with various organizations that I know otherwise I would be appearing on behalf of. But I do want to level set the testimony I'm about to give. I'm not appearing here this morning on behalf of Starbucks. Starbucks is not a member of our trade association. I've had no contact whatsoever with the company preparing my testimony. But that said, I'm deeply troubled by the attacks on that company and other employers in this country. The so-called public shaming, incorrect information, misleading information is very troubling. As many have noted, Starbucks, yes, has received increased union activity, but Dr. Fox, as you mentioned, when you look at their owned stores, less than 3% of Starbucks employees have decided, at least at this point, that they desire union representation. And when you put into that mix the licensed stores, it's less than 1%. We don't see that in the media. Furthermore, thousands of workers at Starbucks have rejected union representation. And what you don't see are the elections that the union did not prevail in. And all due respect to my fellow witness, thousands of workers at Starbucks do not desire union representation. So let's take these so-called allegations also for what they are worth. Virtually every union organizing campaign, many unfair labor practice charges are filed, but later dismissed. Indeed, the dismissal factor is 70, 80, 90%. So there has been no final adjudication that I'm aware of finding Starbucks in violation of our nation's labor laws. Just let's make that clear. Just on a personal note, my wife and I go to Starbucks stores all over the country. I think they're well run, they're clean, they're efficient. I like the Wi-Fi service, the coffee's great. And by the way, the internet service is great. So let's not publicly shame a company that's provided thousands and thousands of jobs in this country and has provided good community relations and has been a leader in benefits. That shouldn't happen. Second, on a general note, other employers in this country seem to be publicly shamed inappropriately. We have particularly new companies that are providing thousands and thousands of jobs in this country, good paying jobs. But the litmus test apparently is if they speak out at all on a different perspective of whether unionization makes sense at all, they are publicly shamed or criticized. That's wrong. The narrative clearly appears to be to muzzle the employer community, not permit them to have any voice whatsoever in this discussion of whether unions make sense or not, and unions may have a place in certain instances. Unions have new leadership, and Liz Schuler, she's a very bright lady, and maybe they will change some of their approaches. But let's not publicly shame the job providers in this country that have provided literally thousands of jobs. You should not be a second-class citizen in this country because you're one of 94% that don't work under a union contract in the private sector. And employers that employ those 94+% of our population shouldn't be publicly shamed. They're providing jobs to this country. So we've got their narrative all wrong. Now, just a few points in my written testimony that I'd like to review. First, as noted by Chairman Scott and also by you, Dr. Fox, approval rating of unions just are generally in the 70th percentile pursuant to a recent Gallup poll. But what's not noted is that only about 11% of the polling individuals really expressed an interest in joining a union, and perhaps even more importantly, 58% said they had no interest in specifically becoming a union member. Now why is that? There's a number of reasons, but according to polling of American Compass and other organizations, workers in this country, if they're going to be represented, don't want a union that's adversarial, and I'm quite concerned about the potential pending rail strike, by the way, that could shut down this country. They don't want confrontation. They don't want adversarial unions. They don't want their unions going out on political and social ventures. They want them to represent their interest and voice. But for reasons I've stated in my testimony, unions don't appear to be doing that. They have lost sight of their central function. As stated in my testimony, unions are not going after their potential population of growth. Indeed, their spend on traditional union organizing activity is very low. Now, they can speak for themselves why that is, but when they come to the halls of Congress and want you to pass the PRO Act, the worst, and I'll stand by this statement, I know others will, the worst one-sided proposal in labor relations ever in the halls of this Congress. It is so tilted in one manner, it really doesn't deserve much time or attention. But unfortunately, I guess we'll have to talk about it under the heated political rhetoric that we are seeing today. But specifically, I hope the committee will look deeply at any allegations of employer misconduct. Ms. Brottenberger's testimony should be looked at under the guise of footnote 2. She has all these statistics, but she does disclose to her credit that they are a result of interviewing professional union organizers. It's a very one-sided study. It's been discredited continually. So I don't give any credit whatsoever to that data. If you're gonna have a full and complete study, you need to talk to all individuals involved in organizing. Certainly union organizers have a perspective, I respect that, but it's not an accurate or objective perspective.
You're running a little over.
Yes, I'll just have one final point and I'll quit. Mr. Pierce, who I have great respect for, properly stated that the policy of this country is to promote collective bargaining. He's right, but what he didn't share with you is that employees first have to decide whether they wish to have union representation. The Act is very clear on that. We need to preserve that right by secret ballot elections. So I think we've got the cart before the horse here. Let's make sure employees have an uncoerced, fair, and ample opportunity to hear both sides and then make a decision. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Eisen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Fox, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Michelle Eisen, and I am a barista at the Starbucks on Elmwood Avenue in Buffalo, New York, the first Starbucks to unionize. I began my career with Starbucks in 2010. I needed a part-time job that would provide me with health benefits and also complement my other career as a theatrical stage manager. Starbucks offered both of those things, as well as the opportunity to work for a company that had a reputation of being progressive, caring about its communities, and most importantly, taking care of its employees. And for a time, I felt that to be true. Unfortunately, over the last several years, things began to shift within the company. The cost of the benefits increased while the coverage decreased, and wages did not keep up. Other benefits were completely taken away without warning or explanation. But the clearest difference was the overall decline in the everyday working conditions on the floors of the cafes. This decline became drastic during the COVID-19 pandemic, when Starbucks boasted record profits, but simply treated us, its workers, as disposable. This nearly led to me leaving a company I had devoted over a decade of my life to. But instead, I was presented with the opportunity to try to unionize my store. The company's response to our organizing campaign was not at all what I expected. I realize now how naive that was, but I truly believe that Starbucks was at heart the progressive company it proclaimed itself to be. We were simply expressing our desire for reasonable improvements to our working conditions, particularly when it came to our health and safety. And the only way to accomplish this was to make sure we had a true voice in the company policies that affected us. Within 2 weeks of filing our first petitions with the NLRB, the company shut down 2 stores it perceived had strong union support, one permanently and the other for months. They also quickly shipped in over 100 out-of-town managers and upper-level corporate to infiltrate our cafes, surveil and intimidate workers, and shut down our stores in order to hold anti-union meetings, which workers needed to attend in order to get paid. They went from offering us the world if we voted no, to threatening to take away our benefits if we voted to unionize. And when that didn't work and we won our union anyway, they began to discipline us, then fire us, then permanently close our stores. And as our campaign moved from Buffalo to a national scale, so did Starbucks union busting. And that behavior has only increased tenfold since the return of Howard Schultz as interim CEO in April of this year. Starbucks has fired over 100 union leaders and supporters to date, many just in the previous weeks. Starbucks has no regard for our legal rights, and they will never stop on their own. In the last year, the union has filed over 350 unfair labor practice charges against Starbucks with the NLRB. The NLRB has so far issued administrative complaints against Starbucks in almost 100 ULPs, alleging over 600 legal violations. Some of these alleged violations affected every Starbucks worker in the country. And Starbucks workers are not alone in this struggle. Workers involved in other large organizing efforts at places such as Amazon, Chipotle, Trader Joe's, and Apple have faced very similar union busting from their companies. But despite this overwhelmingly negative response from Starbucks, we find ourselves at the forefront of a new labor movement. Over 6,300 Starbucks workers have unionized at over 237 locations across the US so far. But these victories are due entirely to the courage of these workers in the face of this abusive conduct by the company. It should not take an act of bravery to ensure that you have a voice at work. We need Starbucks to recognize our desire to organize, which the NLRA explicitly states is our right. We need Starbucks to stop mistreating the workers it claims to care about and to fulfill its legal obligation to come to the table and negotiate with us in good faith. We are tired of fighting a company that can afford to do better by its hourly workers. We are tired of listening to billionaire CEOs take sole credit for the billions of dollars of profit made off our labor. We are tired of watching Starbucks continue to violate workers' rights, knowing that the law will fail to offer any meaningful consequences. But most of all, we are tired of fighting Howard Schultz's ego. We need people in power to call Starbucks out for this repulsive behavior because worker rights are human rights. We need labor law reform like the PRO Act so that the laws work to protect the people they were put in place for. We need better funding for the NLRB so that the agency has the resources it needs to enforce the law. We need you to stand with us as the American labor movement does what it always has. Fight for a future that is just and works for all of us. Thank you. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you. Now we'll go to member questions, and we'll begin with the gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing today. Did my time start, Mr. Chairman? Not clear.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. For holding this hearing today to focus on the importance of protecting workers and the right to organize, for better wages, better benefits, and safer working conditions. And thank you to the witnesses for being here. It's an honor to represent a district in one of the most labor and worker-friendly states in the nation. Liz Schuler, the president of the AFL-CIO, I'm proud to say, is from Oregon. Oregon had the second largest year-over-year increase in total union election petitions to the NLRB between 2022. Oregon also had the third highest number of Starbucks election petitions of any state in the country at 24. I was pleased to see that in the district I represent, Starbucks workers at 5 locations have successfully completed union elections. And although we have not seen retaliatory efforts, as we heard from Ms. Eisen, from any of the Starbucks locations in Northwest Oregon, we know that food service workers in other parts of the country and at other companies such as Chipotle are experiencing employer retaliation against their organizing efforts. The sharp increase in union petitions and NLRB cases over the last year affirms the need for more funding and capacity at that agency, which Ms. Eisen just mentioned in her testimony. So I want to ask Dr. Bronfenbrenner and Ms. Eisen, what is your perspective on how limited capacity at the NLRB and the NLRB funding crisis, how does that affect elections and the ability of workers to seek and obtain legal recourse when their rights are violated? And I'll start with Ms. Eisen and then Dr. Bronfenbrenner, and I do want to get another question in.
Thank you for that question. The longer it takes for an election to go forward, a lot of that is determined by the funding of the agency that oversees that. The longer these companies have to enact their union-busting behavior and abuse these workers, I mean, that's simply just the rule of what it is. The longer it takes for us to have that vote, the longer the company has the ability to come in and surveil and intimidate and make workers afraid of expressing their desire to organize. We also see an issue when it comes to dealing with the complaints and the charges filed regarding unfair labor practices. There have been hundreds of unfair labor practice charges filed during this union campaign at Starbucks, and as of today, the NLRB has only been able to investigate 30% of those charges.
And Dr. Bronfenbrenner, what can you add in terms of what increased funding would mean at the NLRB?
Workers at Chipotle in Maine organized 9 months ago, have been waiting 9 months for an election to be set. 9 months is because of the delay, it's because of the staffing at the NLRB. And 9 months go by, that is 9 months where employers are engaging in threats, intimidation, and coercion that act like waves against the support for the unionization.
Thank you. And I don't want to cut you off, Dr. Bronfenbrenner, but I want to move on to another delay. I'm concerned by reports of employers that try to quash a new union by prolonging bargaining through a combination of legal appeals and delays. Some cases that's taken years, as we've seen, particularly in the healthcare sector in Northwest Oregon. Willamette Valley Medical Center prolonged negotiation with the Oregon Nurses Association to the extent that it took 2 years to reach a first contract. And we're seeing similar things at the Legacy's Unity Center for Behavioral Health, where it took 18 months to reach a first contract with the Oregon Nurses Association. Dr. Bronfenbrenner, and I want to ask Mr. Pierce to weigh in quickly on this. How often do we see similar cases, and what would the PRO Act do to hold employers whose workers have successfully unionized accountable if they deliberately prolong contract negotiations? Maybe about a half a minute each. Sorry.
Under our labor law, if an employer decides to refuse to bargain, the only penalty we have is a notice telling them to bargain in good faith. That has allowed employers to just refuse to honor the act, and we see delays that go, as I said earlier, so that we have only 36% have a contract within a year, but a third of unions who have won the elections don't have a contract 4 years after the election.
Wow. And Mr. Pierce, can you add to that in my remaining half minute, please? What would the PRO Act do to help?
What the PRO Act would do is create a roadmap for workers and management to reach a first contract, because the workers would be required, employers would be required to start bargaining within 10 days of being certified for an election. And if there are problems with that, it can go to arbitration, interest arbitration and the like. So there's a full court press to make sure that dilatory tactics don't take place under the
I
PRO
appreciate
Act.
that. And this is after workers have decided to unionize. Sometimes it can take years to reach a first contract, and that's unacceptable, and it's why we need the PRO Act. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Young lady's time has expired. Gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today as witnesses. Mr. King, economic research shows that right-to-work states like my home state of South Carolina enjoy greater job growth and higher per capita disposable income when adjusted for costs of living when compared to forced union states. And South Carolina has especially benefited from a right-to-work environment where people can voluntarily join a union. They're not forced to join a union. In fact, right-to-work means jobs. And specifically, it's amazing, in the last 35 years, South Carolina has developed an automobile manufacturing capability, a tire manufacturing capability. South Carolina now is the leading exporter of cars of any state in the union, with no unions being forced. And additionally, South Carolina, we want everybody to know, is also the leading manufacturer of tires of any state in the United States. We benefit from investments from France, from Japan, from Germany, from Singapore. And to go from zero manufacturing of tires to be the leading manufacturer and exporter. And a reason for that is right to work, that people have a choice of joining a union or not. Could you give why you believe that right to work states are more in?
I'm sorry, I think your microphone went off, Mr. Wilson, right at the end. I didn't hear the end of the question.
And I don't blame anybody for doing that. Anyway, why are right-to-work states more attractive for entrepreneurs and for workers alike?
Thank you. I've been to South Carolina many times. Great state.
We still have one condo left. Come on.
Workers today want flexibility. They don't want to be told what to do, whether it be by the employer every day, every hour. They want flexibility. They want voice. But they don't want to be told what to do by a union also. They don't want to be required to pay dues and fees if they choose not to. And South Carolina, like 26 other states in the country, have decided that the right-to-work approach is the better approach. We can debate that, but the PRO Act, Mr. Wilson, would overrule that. It would permit employers and unions to say right to work makes no difference, even though the electorate of South Carolina have voted to have a right to work status, which is their right currently under the law. The PRO Act takes that away. And many members of this committee are from states that have right to work status. So the PRO Act would overrule that, a big mistake.
And I'm personally concerned for the hospitality industry. We benefit so much from Myrtle Beach to Charleston to Hilton Head. The jobs that are created, particularly entry-level jobs, and card check would just be catastrophic. I've, in the past, represented the Indian American community, AHOA, Asian American hotel owners, and they would just be catastrophically affected if they couldn't run their motels and hotels and restaurants. And so I particularly identify with what you said. Along with that, I'm grateful to be the sponsor of the National Right to Work Act, which erases automatic dues clauses in federal statute without adding a single letter to federal law. The PRO Act bans right-to-work laws, as you stated, which are implemented in 27 states. Democrats claim this is necessary to avoid a free rider problem of workers benefiting from union representation without paying for it, but many workers do not want union representation, making them forced riders rather than free riders. And again, how do we, what do we say to workers who want to represent themselves?
Well, we ought to be saying they ought to have that opportunity. And what we are seeing consistently, Mr. Wilson, from polling data, that workers today don't want to be represented by any entity, any union that gets so involved in an adversarial approach with their employer and spends thousands of dollars on political and social activities that they don't agree with. The American Compass polling was very informative in this. Workers want, if they're going to have a union that would work with their employer, partner with their employer, and concentrate on terms and conditions of employment. But that's not the case. And the American worker today is very sophisticated. And they can tell when they're being abused or used and when their dues monies are being spent inappropriately. So I think back to choice is very important. Why should this body or any body of government overrule employee choice? Let's have free and fair elections, secret ballot elections. Card check is a subterfuge. It doesn't work. Electronic voting doesn't work. We need to have free and fair secret ballot elections. If workers decide they wish representation, that's acceptable. But don't force it upon the employee. Don't muzzle the employer from at least having an opportunity to speak.
Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In September 2020, registered nurses at Mission Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, won the first ever private sector hospital union, NLRB, election in North Carolina. And during that election, which occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic, the hospital corporation that owns Mission started pulling nurses away from patients to attend anti-union meetings, union busting, inviting consultants to walk through the hospital without masks to spread anti-union misinformation. And a few days before ballots were mailed out by the NLRB, a supervisor threatened that if nurses successfully organized a union, the nurses' childcare needs would not be accommodated. So Professor Bronfenbrenner, would you say that these tactics are typical of what employers engage in during an organizing campaign? And how would increasing NLRB funding help with this?
Yes, the tactics that happen at Mission Hospital represent what the traditional anti-union campaign is. Employer campaigns rest on the principle of using threats, intimidation, promises, interrogation, and retaliation. And those were all elements of the campaign. And the majority of employers engage in those tactics. And when those are repeated over time, it becomes a cumulative effect, which intensifies the effect. What would happen with increased NLRB funding is would get investigations sooner, unfair labor practices would be determined sooner, and they would be able to enforce the act sooner. When they are understaffed, it means these campaigns go on without any decision from the NLRB, even though the unfair labor practices have occurred.
Wow. Thank you for that. So would you, research indicates, this is for you again, that union organizing helps to narrow the gender wealth gap. So with Black Women's Equal Pay Day coming up next week, have you seen similar trends with the racial wealth gap also becoming narrower with the increase in union activity and collective bargaining?
There's no question that unionization narrows the gap in terms of race, gender, disability, because unions end arbitrary supervisor power and ensure equality in the workplace through raising wages across the board and providing benefits across the board and improving the standard of living of all workers. And also because the majority of union contracts, first contracts, have language that allows workers to grieve discrimination or unfairness in these economic decisions. I would also add that women of color are the workers most likely to organize in this country, and with good reason. They see the benefits of unionization.
Okay, so are they more successful at organizing?
Yes, they are.
Okay, well, that's a good thing. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. King, thank you for taking time to be with us today. As you know, labor union membership continues to plummet due to modern economy, economic growth, and unions' own failings. Workers' disenchantment with union representation has created a real crisis for union professionals, union bosses. Despite these facts, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle introduced H.R. 842, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or more commonly referred to as the PRO Act, which fulfills their campaign promises to union bosses and trial lawyers, really at the expense of business owners, workers, and the American public. Specifically, this bill imposes forced unionization, eliminates employer rights to privacy, abolishes employer rights, undermines the independent contractor status, and disrupts the economy, so much more. So instead of increasing transparency and accountability to better serve their members, union leaders are exerting their political influence to demand radical national labor laws like the PRO Act, which would allow them to further consolidate power, coerce workers, and bolster their own political agendas. Mr. King, the PRO Act requires employers to turn over workers' home addresses, cell phone numbers, and personal email addresses. My Democratic colleagues are getting as bad as Facebook in terms of disrespecting people's privacy. And that's regardless of whether a worker wants that information shared or not. Now, does the bill, first question for you, based on your knowledge, Mr. King, does the bill, the PRO Act, include any restrictions on how that information can be used and stored, or could unions sell it to other organizations such as political action committees?
The first answer to your question is yes. Most people are not aware of these privacy intrusions that the PRO Act would implement. You're absolutely right. Under the PRO Act, a worker would have no opportunity, no right to opt out, and her or his personal information, her or his cell phone number, email address would all be disclosed to the petitioning union and the federal government. There is no restrictions whatsoever on how that, no protections for the worker, and the misuse or abuse of that information, even inadvertent, is well documented. The federal government, as we all know, could not keep track of personnel records and had massive hacking and leaks. Unfortunately, employers have also had that experience. So the privacy intrusions that the PRO Act would implement are not known, maybe to many members of Congress, frankly, that even voted for this bill, but the American general public does not have, I think, any knowledge of any great depth of how intrusive this bill would be.
Well, thank you. The follow-up to that, could this bill potentially result in workers' information falling into the wrong hands, or in workers, more specifically, workers receiving more unsolicited calls and emails?
Absolutely, because their email addresses I noted, their personal cell phone information, as I noted, would be given to the union and to the federal government, the National Labor Relations Board, and there's no way to protect that. Why is that needed? Frankly, there are other means of communication, but to intrude in an individual's privacy, irrespective of how you feel about unions and employers, is a policy mistake. And that's one of the major deficiencies of the PRO Act, among many others.
Well, thank you, Mr. King. I have one more question. You know, the PRO Act makes it significantly more difficult for workers to be classified as independent contractors. Mm-hmm. What impact would this have on workforce innovations like the app-based economy that has created countless new opportunities for workers, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic as we observed?
Well, it's again a major policy error. Individuals want flexibility. They want to work when they want to work, where they want to work. They want to work for multiple employers. They want to be independent, and the PRO Act would take that option away. That's, again, a major policy mistake. And, of course, the ultimate objective here is, at least from an organized labor perspective, is to make every individual an employee so the union then could attempt to organize that individual. But as I show in my testimony, the union has not done a very effective job in even trying to reach out to the regular employees in this country, let alone potential change in independent contractor status.
All right. Thank you, Mr. King. Thank you, Chairman. I yield.
Thank you. Gentleman from California, Mr. Chicano.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, for holding this important hearing, highlighting the increase in worker organizing across the country. And while we have seen a significant spike in worker attempts to organize, the government agency tasked with U.S. labor law, the National Labor Relations Board, has been chronically underfunded. The NLRB has the vested power to safeguard the rights of employees interested in organizing labor unions. This government agency also acts to prevent unscrupulous labor practices committed by private sector employees. As a result of the agency's flat funding, staffing shortages and delays in decisions and elections have been commonplace, and this poses an inherent problem for workers as efforts to unionize have recently surged. The NLRB has publicly docketed 349 election petitions for Starbucks workers across the country in 37 states. These workers are organizing and advocating for higher wages, better benefits, and safer workplaces. When we strengthen and protect the collective bargaining rights of workers, we are improving the lives of workers and strengthening the economy. Congress must pass the Protecting the Right to Organize, or PRO Act, and adequately fund the NLRB. The House passed this measure in March 2021, and if passed, would stand as the most significant improvement to labor law in decades. California, like most of the country, is seeing a big increase in union election petitions and unfair labor practice charges right now. In my own district, a Starbucks location has had their employees vote to unionize, and a majority of the employees voted in favor of creating a union, and their employer has challenged the result of that election. So my first question is to Ms. Eisen. Ms. Eisen, in June, the NLRB's general counsel filed a complaint against Starbucks for, among other things, telling a transgender employee that they could lose gender-affirming healthcare benefits if they organized. News reports indicate that this is a tactic the company has used at multiple locations. Can you explain the chilling effect that these threats have had on trans workers and how it has affected the organizing drive?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. The threat of the loss of benefits has been a talking point from Starbucks corporate since day one of our campaign. This is going back to August of 2021. Specifically targeting transgender partners is particularly sickening, in my opinion, because the company has prided itself on its reputation of attracting all sorts of workers and people and offering them benefits that they can't get anywhere else. So to purposefully offer that to our transgendered workers and then tell them, but those benefits no longer apply to you if you decide you'd like to have a voice in your workplace. It doesn't even go along with Starbucks' own mission and values. As far as what the chilling effect is, people are afraid. They're afraid that the place that they came to work for, who said that they could help them, could offer these benefits and help them become the people that they want to be, that no longer applies to them because they chose to stand with their fellow workers at that store and demand that the company have some level of accountability.
Well, thank you, Ms. Eisen. I have another question for you. The cafe where you work organized in late December of last year, and it has been almost 9 months since the workers won their election, but they have not yet reached a first collective bargaining agreement with Starbucks. Why has it taken so long to reach an agreement? And what has been the sticking points at the table?
The simple answer is that we haven't reached an agreement because Starbucks doesn't want to. We were certified on December 16th of 2021, and we sent our demand to bargain a few days later. It took them far longer than it should have to respond to a simple email. It took almost, I think, 2 months to get to that first bargaining session. The workers at my store have been ready to bargain from day one. The sticking points have been mostly just delay tactics and insults from the company and their spokespeople. We actually don't really talk to many of the corporate members. Their main spokesperson is a Littler Mendelsohn attorney who spends more time being condescending and not taking our concerns seriously than they do actually looking at proposals.
Well, thank you, Ms. Eisen. Mr. Chairman, it's very clear to me that, our law, the PRO Act, is on the side of workers, and we're looking to reduce the polarization of our workforce in terms of wages and the income disparities. And the big key solution to that is empowering workers through their ability to organize. And I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being with us today. Empowering employers and their employees to succeed and prosper is a leading priority for this committee. Unfortunately, working families and job creators seem to be facing an onslaught of activist policies and decisions by the current National Labor Relations Board aimed at chilling employer free speech and crippling worker free choice. I grew up in a union household, south side of Chicago. My father was a machinist and union organizer for part of his career. Americans have the right to organize and join a union if they choose, and they should be armed with all the information they need to make an informed decision before casting their vote. Unfortunately, the PRO Act would codify the Obama-era NLRB's ambush election rule, which would significantly shorten the period of time between a union filing for an election and the election being held to as little as 11 days. Additionally, we have recently seen the NLRB under General Counsel Abruzzo discard decades of case law and NLRB precedent upholding an employer's right to educate its employees about unionization. Instead, the General Counsel is arguing that it is an unfair labor practice for employers to require employees on paid work time to attend meetings where the employer expresses its opinion concerning unionization. Mr. King, do you think the General Counsel's legal argument is sound?
No. Mr. Wahlberg, nice to see you again, and you nailed it. This attempt to muzzle an employer from stating a position, and I certainly would counsel an employer to say so in a non-coercive, thoughtful way, which virtually every employer does. But the attempt by this General Counsel is, in this area, a direct violation of Section 8C of the National Labor Relations Act, which is the free speech provision. It's an attempt not to have all perspectives, all thoughts, all ideas regarding unionization out on the table for the worker to decide. It's an attempt to stop a free flow of communication. And that's throughout the PRO Act and through this public shaming that I mentioned at the outset of my testimony that's going on in this country.
Let me just ask this question that I almost hesitate to ask because it sounds so common sense. The answer, I think, so common sense and simplistic. But why is it important for workers to hear from both the union and employer before casting a vote in a representation election and having more than 11 days to make the decision?
Well, first of all, Mr. Wahlberg, the union can take years, months, to put an organizing campaign together and then file a petition. So it's had a great advantage already in time. And then to tell workers that they only have 11 days to make an informed decision and gather information from all sides. The union certainly has a right to have a voice, but so does the employer. And here's the real sticking point here. A decision as to whether a bargaining unit is established at a place of employment has decades and decades of impact. Once the union is certified, it stays there virtually for the entire life of that company's presence at that location. So this is a very serious decision. It has consequences regarding dues payments, fees payments, potential for strike, et cetera. So this is a decision that ought to be made seriously, thoughtfully, and over at least a 30 to 60 day period, not 11 days.
If we're concerned about transparency, it seems like that would be helpful. In your experience, do workers generally want to hear from employers?
Well, I think they want to hear from all sides, yes. I think what we are seeing in the polling data, what we are hearing, at least from our members, and we represent most of the Fortune 400 companies in the country, country. Their employees want a voice. They want to be heard. They want to listen. They want information. They don't want to have only one side of the story. And I keep hearing these allegations against Starbucks. Let's set the record straight. That is just not fact. Yes, there are allegations, but there has not been one final adjudication of guilt against this company. Let's get that clear. These allegations are part of an ongoing public smear campaign that we often see in union organizing. Let's wait until we get a final adjudication. If the company did something wrong, so be it. But let's not find them guilty until they have had a fair trial, or any employer's had a fair trial.
I think the best aspect is transparency, opportunity to have all sides, and then let the employee decide. So, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to talk about surveillance, but I want to give Ms. Eisen.
Ms. Jayapal, are you on screen?
No, I'm in the room, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, there you are. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to just give Ms. Eisen a chance to respond to what we just heard in terms of employees wanting to hear from the company. It sounds really good, but tell us about what a captive audience meeting is like, actually, Ms. Eisen. Do you feel like you get a chance to hear from the company in sort of a neutral way, or how would you describe that?
My apologies. I can say from my own experience in captive audience meetings held by Starbucks during our organizing campaign, they are far from impartial. You are not hearing both sides of the story. You are hearing one side. We were brought to hotel conference rooms located far from our store. Most Starbucks workers had to find transportation because we are a city store that most of our workers don't drive. That wasn't offered to them. They had to find a way to get to these. Then we had to sit in a room with high-ranking members of corporate, as far up as the president of Starbucks North America, whom we had only just met, where we were talked at for nearly an hour about why we should feel ashamed of asking for more from a company that had already given us so much. But they were only giving us the facts. They were giving us the facts about what the company was, what the company wanted. They wanted us to vote no. They were there to take care of everything. They were going to make sure that any grievance we had was handled. And if we needed facts from the union, we needed to contact a union organizer. And when presented with the fact that the union organizers, as far as the Starbucks campaign, were Starbucks workers, some of whom were sitting in that room with them, that is not something that they wanted to hear. They didn't want to be presented with the fact that it wasn't a third party, there wasn't some big union boss out there corralling these workers and convincing them that this was their best interest. It was the workers making that decision for themselves. But we were not given the same time or opportunity to speak in that room to our coworkers about why we felt this was a better option for us.
Hardly an impartial discussion of facts and all sides being presented. I wanted to talk about surveillance because I think that changing technology and employer strategies have increased the surveillance of workers, especially when employers are confronted with the union campaign. Employers are monitoring social media accounts, installing hidden cameras, analyzing GPS data, and exploiting phone and computer applications to keep tabs on organizing efforts, in addition to the more conventional forms of management scrutiny. Ms. Eisen, in your experience organizing with Starbucks Workers United, how has Starbucks surveilled unionization campaigns?
Well, the in-person surveillance is the most apparent. I think I mentioned in my testimony the out-of-town corporate and support managers that were shipped in. What these support managers were shipped in for was to be stationed in all of our stores under the guise that we had only filed for union petitions because the management was so poor in Buffalo that it necessitated that. So these managers were supposed to come in and support our store managers. The actuality was it turned our stores so that every operating hour that the store was open, there was managerial presence. Not just there to support our store manager, but on the floors with us, interrupting conversations or trying to prevent any conversations from happening about the union. It also forced a lot of the workers who were pro-union and were wearing pins from the onset of the campaign to remove those pins, not because they were no longer for the union, but because they felt that wearing that pin made them a target. It was intimidating doesn't seem like a strong enough word. It's a job that requires a lot of skill, and when you feel like you're doing that under a microscope, it has quite a toll on your mental health.
A chilling effect. In July, Chipotle abruptly announced the closure of a store in Augusta, Maine, hours before a union vote was slated to take place. About 20 Starbucks locations have been closed in recent months, including a couple in my home district of Seattle, Starbucks' hometown, and a disproportionate number of these stores were organizing. What message are these closures sending, and how does it impact workers' livelihoods?
I mean, the only message that it can be sending is that if you choose to unionize your workplace, the company's going to come in and shut down your store. It's breeding fear. It's following through on threats that they had made throughout the campaign, and it's inappropriate and not right.
Thank you very much, Ms. Eisen, and I appreciate your courage. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
I don't know if it was the intent, but it seems like a lot of the rhetoric here today is kind of blasting Howard Schultz and saying what a horrible boss he is, I guess. I will point out that Howard Schultz has won the National Equal Justice Award from the NAACP, so you can take whatever lessons you want out of that. Now, Mr. King, a couple questions. It seems to me one of the reasons for upward mobility in the United States, or one of the ways to make more money, is to work hard. Does unionization, what effect does that have on hard working? Does it make it more difficult for a person who really works hard and wants to move up to distinguish himself from his fellow employees?
Well, unfortunately, most union contracts are strict seniority type of agreements. So promotions, job advancement is based on tenure, not necessarily merit. Now, that does vary from location to location, but it certainly can be an impediment. And if you have multiple unions at a location, if an employee is in a union-covered contract X, she or he won't have an ability, as a general rule, to bid on work for a contract that's covered through Union Y. So they are foreclosed. So the lack of mobility and flexibility is hampered considerably.
So we penalize the more ambitious or more hardworking. Next question. Sometimes I know a guy who's got a union place, and he feels one of the things that's frustrating is if he wants to do things differently, to make things more efficient, that can be subject to bargaining. So in other words, it becomes more difficult to make a factory. I guess I think of factories a lot because manufacturing is so important for this country's survival. Does this make things more difficult to change things in the factory and try to make it more efficient, which is so vital if we're going to continue to compete with the Chinese, the Indians, what have you?
Yes, you are correct. One of the things we hear consistently is that union contracts, union presence hampers the speed of decision-making, which is critical for economic survival for employers in this country, particularly given increased global competition. If you have a collective bargaining agreement in place, it's harder to make decisions to shift work to different areas, perhaps of the plant, to adjust wages and benefits. You have to bargain about that. That's part of our law, and we understand that. But the lack of flexibility, the lack of the ability to make expeditious decisions is certainly hindered.
Okay. Next question. I like the little guy. I like it when somebody goes into business themselves and likes the independence. I really didn't like this COVID thing where, at least in my state, they let Walmart stay open, but the little retail houses had to shut down. And I think it is because some politicians just, I guess, prefer the big guy. You know, they wish everybody had to shop at Walmart and a little gift shop We like to have them go under. One of the ways you can start out knowing your own business is by a franchise. You know, and I think it's good. We have a lot of, McDonald's, there's a place in West Bend called Culver's. A lot of these franchise places allow a little guy to build some equity, be his own boss. I'm told that this PRO Act would make it more difficult and instead would kind of force anybody one more time into the big corporate model. Is that true?
Yes. The PRO Act provisions that would embody the joint employer test that's being articulated by some in this country to make everyone one employer would interfere with franchise operations. There's an all-out attack, unfortunately, on the franchise community in this country, and it's really wrong.
Yeah, it's just another way to hurt the little guy, the little hardworking, ambitious guy. Can't start your own McDonald's, can't start your own Culver's, got to work under the big, we want to make everybody have to work for a Walmart type situation. Next question. As I understand it, when you vote under this card check thing, this vote is not necessarily anymore a private vote. Now, I know there are people who like, on a national level, on regular elections, they like to have absentee voting where somebody, you don't know for sure who's filling out the ballot, or maybe, your boyfriend, girlfriend fill it out for you and say, here, sign here. I would be shocked that people, does this really mean that people are going to have to vote publicly, take away the right of the private ballot? That seems almost unbelievable. Is that true?
Well, frankly, I'm not sure where the proponents are coming from, whether it be electronic voting or some other type of open voting process. You know what the real tragedy is here? We have had a very successful on-site manual voting election process in this country under the National Labor Relations Act, where 80–90% of the potential voters show up. They mark their ballots in secrecy in an enclosed setting. No one knows how they vote. Why are we changing that or even considering changing?
Well, the only reason I can think of is you want to force people to vote the way they don't want to vote. In other words, you want to take away the right to vote by their own conscience. That's the only reason you do it. Thank you, Mr. King.
Well, I just would add one thing to your question, and/or the proponents of these proposals don't want people to vote at all, because unless you have an opportunity to walk down from your place of employment, from your desk or wherever, and vote, people forget or they just don't vote, and that's wrong. We ought to encourage as many people to vote in these elections as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlelady from.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome, Mr. Grothman. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to do a speed round here. I have a lot of questions to ask, and I'll probably speak quickly, and I would ask that the witnesses try to keep their answers brief so that I can get through them. I want to start with you, Mr. Pierce. On July 15th of this year, the NLRB announced that its staff in the field offices was a mere 50%. 50 organizing boom. How does the board's current level of staffing and funding compare to when you were chairman? And could you also just comment on how that flat funding has harmed the agency and how it's affected the board's ability to investigate and resolve complex or large-scale cases such as the current investigations into Amazon?
Well, it's a radical decrease from when I was chair. When the Republican administration came, the first thing that they did was offer buyouts, so all of the experienced people took advantage of that. Then they did not backfill. Statistics show that the hiring was of approximately 13 people as opposed to the 94% of backfilling that takes place when reductions in staff took place. 50% at the regional level is devastating towards the processing of the agenda of the National Labor Relations Board. Investigating and dealing with elections are at the heart and the soul of what the board does. It is what the public is seeing. The board at its investigative stage is the one that is the stage where unfair labor practices are flushed out, and it's determined whether or not the law has been broken. During the pandemic, you had a situation where many more elections had to be, because of health reasons, conducted by mail ballot election. That's labor intensive.
Sure it
And
is.
to have less people to be able to do that job affects the process substantially. So the American public throws up its hands in frustration because of the ineffectiveness.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Dr. Bronfenbrenner, I have a quick question for you. You discussed the alarming trend of employer surveillance of workers' social media. Can you talk about the form that surveillance takes and to what extent you've seen social media used for blacklisting?
If you do a quick search on the internet, you'll find that there are numerous companies that advertise themselves as their ability to track social media, and that employers should turn to them. These companies can search social media for employers and quickly ascertain, who's posted information. And then what we find is that employers discharge workers, eliminate their jobs, and a perfect example is what happened at No Evil Foods, where just 2 weeks after workers posted a petition about health and safety conditions on the internet, majority of the workers who signed that petition lost their jobs.
Thank you very much. Ms. Eisen, in your testimony, you refer to Starbucks' relentless abuse and delay tactics when it comes to first contract negotiations. Can you discuss with us a little bit how management has stalled contract negotiations? And do you believe that the goal is to decertify the union?
I do personally believe that, and being at the very first store to be certified, that's troublesome to me. What we've seen is a very slow, and I would say sluggish, response to demands to bargain. Sometimes taking months to respond to an initial demand to bargain from a certified location. And then when a response does come in, it looks like an automated response. Thank you for sending us your demand to bargain. We look forward to talking to you, and we'll always send a date range with our
It
demand.
takes months to get that automated response?
Yes, it has.
Okay. Can you also talk just briefly about the impact of mandatory captive audience meetings and other tactics used to intimidate workers?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, they'll never call it a captive audience meeting. They call them listening sessions. Not that that's any better. But what they were doing in Buffalo was shutting the stores down in order to hold these captive audience meetings. So if you were one of the workers who was supposed to work the shift that was canceled because the store was being closed, you were told that in order to be paid for what was your scheduled shift, you would need to attend this meeting. You're telling an hourly worker living paycheck to paycheck that the only way to be paid for their scheduled shift is to come to a captive audience meeting. You can say that's not a mandatory meeting, but I don't see that these workers have any other choice.
Thank you very much, Ms. Eisen. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today and sharing with us your thoughts about the workforce. We've been in our districts the last 30 days, and I'm going to tell you, I've gotten an earful. What I'm hearing from my constituents, they're sick and tired of this government trying to tell them what is morally right and wrong, what to drive, and by the way, you have to live with our policies whether you like it or not. We know what's best for you. I realized early on in my business career that the workforce was evolving, and now we have the modern workforce, and they're very entrepreneurial. I mean, when you start imposing, well, you have to do this, you have to donate to this political candidate or whatever. I mean, and in fact, over 40% of them support different parties in different elections. So this modern workforce is very entrepreneurial. Our business model changed drastically from we were doing work, basically, we were doing a lot of self-perform work. And in fact, the company I started with, Union Company, we did a lot of self-perform. We got the workers out of the unions. In fact, I was with the Construction Trades Union at Plant Vogel just and you know, I said, hey, we need workers. They can't recruit workers. They can't bring in apprenticeship. You know, I mean, nobody wants to join the union. And of course, you hit on some of the things. I mean, today, you know, I think at least the surveys we did in our company is that, number one, people were created and wired to, and they got to find out where they fit. And, you know, you're just not going to fit with some companies. But it's up to the company to provide that fit for the employee. And when that fit works, you better get out of the way, because that company is going to be very productive, and it's going to grow, and those workers are going to benefit. You know, in my state of Georgia, we have right-to-work laws, okay? And every state is very different. And that is why Senator Scott and I introduced the Employee Rights Act. And we did this because of the importance of assuring that elections are conducted by secret ballot. It requires union dues transparency. It protects the joint employer model for franchises, which the franchise business has been a huge economic engine in this country. It maintains worker status as independent contractors, which is a big part of the construction world, and it protects employee privacy, among other provisions. Mr. King, it's interesting that about 77 Democrats and the Biden NLRB wrote a letter to President Trump urging that Mexican workers have the right to secret ballot. Yet we don't want that in this country. I mean, the height of hypocrisy. Can you explain that?
I wish I could, Mr. Allen, but I can't. It's interesting, while secret ballots are under attack here, and that is the way we make decisions in this country. Everybody that is in this room is a member of Congress is elected by secret ballot. Union officers are elected by secret ballot. Church elections, you name it. What's wrong with the secret ballot election process? I don't think anything. But back to your question, the USMCA agreement is imposing a secret ballot approach on Mexico, and I support that. Our association supports it. That's the way it should be. Mexican workers should have secret ballot election rights. Why don't we have the same standard here? It's total hypocrisy.
Yeah, it makes no sense. It's like we demand other countries protect their borders, yet ours is wide open. I mean, it makes no sense at all. The other thing that's disturbing is that, like I said, Georgia's a right-to-work state. We have great leadership in our state. We have been voted the best state to do business in for I think, 10 years running. We got a lot of economic activity in Georgia. In fact, we're at pre-pandemic economic levels right now. Why is it that other states want us to have to do what they do with their terrible policies, where people are moving out, companies are moving out, businesses are moving out, and they want us to succumb to these same policies? In other words, like I said, what drives my constituents crazy is, you know, this town says, okay, these are the policies. I don't care whether you like them or not, and it's for all the states. Why can't Georgia and the other states decide what's best for them?
Well, as you know, Mr. Allen, the PRO Act would take away, in all essence, right-to-work status for Georgia and 26 other states. And again, it's back to imposing a so-called federal will on the entire country, and that's not what people want.
The American people are not going to stand for this. The American people want choice, and I heard it loud and clear. Thank you, and my time is out, and I yield back.
Mr. Allen, I just want to say one thing. 94% of the workers in the private sector in this country have elected not at this juncture to become part of a union. So back to your point, they want that flexibility.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. Macbeth.
Thank you, Chairman Scott. Move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And thank you so much for hosting this hearing. And thank you to our witnesses here this morning. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day and your schedules to speak before this committee, and these are really incredibly important topics that we're discussing today. And the right to organize for better wages and working conditions is a proud American tradition. It's why this country created a working middle class that was the envy of the world. And it's how we will again create an economy that works for every single American and their families. Employees who commit their blood, their sweat, and their tears to their work, they deserve to live with dignity and respect, to put food on their tables, and to provide better lives for their children and for their grandchildren. Decades of working families being left on the outside looking in has sparked a new wave of organizing efforts in workplaces all across the nation. The National Labor Relations Board has reported that petitions for representation elections during the first 3 quarters of the fiscal year 2022 increased by 58% compared to the same period last year. Despite a major increase in the workload for the NLRB, dedicated funding for this critical agency has remained just stagnant at $274.4 million just since the fiscal year of 2014, effectively resulting in a 25% cut. The NLRB has been wrongfully hamstrung in their efforts to protect Americans as they exercise their rights in the workplace at a moment when more and more people are interested in learning more about the proven benefits that come with joining or organizing a labor union. In order to ensure that every worker in the United States can exercise their rights in the workplace without fear of retaliation, we must provide the NLRB the resources that they need to fulfill their mission to protect the rights of the American people. My question is for Mr. Pierce. As part of the White House Task Force on Organizing and Empowerment, the Department of Labor recently established the Worker Organizing Resource and Knowledge Center, or Work Center, which provides workers and the public with critical information on how to organize, the proven benefits that come with joining a union, and also the importance of labor management cooperation. Workers cannot exercise their rights if they don't know that they have access to these benefits and to these rights. And outreach like this is just really critical for the government to fulfill its statutory mission of protecting freedom of association and promoting collective bargaining. How would ending the NLRB's funding crisis further help this effort?
Thank you for that question. While I was chairman of the NLRB, it was very important to me that there be opportunity for strong outreach and education of the American public. When General Counsel Abruzzo first took the job and thought that there was opportunity to enhance that outreach, she promoted agendas that would promote that. But when we have flat funding, when the agency has flat funding like that, resources have to go towards the processing of the cases, and consequently, a lot of the efforts towards educating the American public, because as you know, the board is reactive. They have to wait for charges to come to them. So there's a presumption that people understand what their rights are before they come into the door. If they don't have that understanding, the board is responsible for having to provide that education. Where outreach is taken away because the board has to designate its resource just to get the cases processed, the American public loses because the American public regrettably remains unaware of what their rights are under the law.
Well, thank you so much for that answer. And I just spent time on Labor Day with our labor unions and just really celebrating all the wonderful work that they've done in protecting the workforce in the country. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The distinguished ranking member of the full committee, Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I want to wish you a speedy recover from your COVID. You don't look too worse the wears, so I'm happy to know that it's not affecting you too negatively.
I think I'm just about one test away from breaking quarantine.
Okay. Mr. King, I really appreciate your comments today, and I have a couple of questions for you. An NLRB employee whistleblower has recently come forward with allegations that NLRB officials engaged in substantial misconduct regarding Starbucks and Workers United elections, including collaborating with Workers United to increase the number of votes cast in favor of the union and affect the outcome of elections. Congress established the NLRB to be impartial and neutral in union elections. If these allegations are proven, does the NLRB risk losing its credibility and legitimacy?
Absolutely. Now, these are allegations, and as I've stressed, the numerous allegations against the company should be treated just as that, also allegations. But, Dr. Fox, if they're proven to be true, they would undermine the credibility and neutrality status of the National Labor Relations Board. It is very troubling. This agency needs to be totally neutral and not take sides in any allegation or in a union-conducted election.
I would say that also should be true of the Secretary of the Department. Mr. King, in 2015, the Obama NLRB issued a decision in the Browning-Ferris industry case that changed the definition of joint employer under the National Labor Relations Act. The decision's vague test was based on indirect and potential control over an employee's terms and conditions of employment. The Browning-Ferris decision replaced the decades-old, clear, and predictable standard of direct and immediate control. In 2020, the Trump NLRB issued a rule restoring the standard of direct and immediate control. But last week, the Biden NLRB issued a proposed rule that would essentially reinstate the Browning-Ferris standard. Could an expansive joint employer standard devastate the franchise business model at a time when many of these small businesses are facing record-breaking inflationary and supply chain pressures?
Yes. The Joint Employer Initiative just announced by the National Labor Relations Board is an attempt to virtually make every employer connected with every other employer in the country, and it's a very harmful approach toward the franchise industry. As noted in the earlier testimony, franchisee operators are some of the best job creators in the country. This is a way for people to better their economic status. So an all-out attack on small business, trying to make them part and parcel of a parent franchisor or try to make them part of another employer's organization is simply a way to extract more dollars in litigation from these small business operators particularly, and discourage them, frankly, from pursuing these types of business models. It's an incorrect policy approach.
Thank you. Mr. King, according to union activists and many in the media, America is seeing a historic surge in union organizing. You have given some statistics as you have testified today, but from your analysis of union election data and union membership rates, is the union movement experiencing a renaissance, or has the media overstated the impact of a few high-profile organizing campaigns?
It's certainly, Dr. Fox, the latter. It's too early to tell, but the media hype that we have seen, where one store with one location asking for potential union representation, or a few, even in Starbucks, we're talking about a very, very small percentage of that total employee population. This is being overhyped. Whether the union movement in this country will have any resurgence or not, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows at this point, but the polling clearly shows a high degree of skepticism. 58% of the polling that we've been talking about here today by Gallup concluded that individuals don't want to be part of a union organization. So I think it's good to talk about developments in labor law. It makes good, maybe, headlines, but people that are reporting this area ought to do their homework and ought to be much more objective. And again, 94% of the private sector workers in this country have decided, for whatever reason, they don't desire union representation at this point. They're not second-class citizens, and their employers are not bad employers. Let's get that straight.
We'd wish that we'd have more objectivity from everybody who pretends to be a journalist. Thank you very much, Mr. King.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and wish you a speedy recovery. Thank you to the witnesses for being here and, talking about objective reality. Ms. Eisen, I want to thank you again for your testimony, which described in real life what you've been going through. And just to buttress that, I can share with you that in New England, where myself and Congresswoman Hayes are from, we're seeing a lot of the same really spontaneous, almost grassroots organizing at Starbucks. One is in Eastern Connecticut, in Vernon, Connecticut, where I'm from, actually, and they had a union vote on July 14th, which again was just completely sort of organic movement that took place there, and the vote was 14-1. Unfortunately, on August 26th, following the July 14th vote, the lead organizer was terminated and, has, by all accounts, had a good work record that he was while he was there. I actually got a text from Congresswoman Pingree, who, again, was indicating that up in Maine, again, another successful Starbucks organizing drive, and the business immediately dramatically cut the store hours. There's a Chipotle is also another chain that, again, is seeing this same phenomenon of people who just basically have been fed up and who, really on their own. They were not sort of driven by external forces coming in. Also organized in Chelly's district, and again, the location was closed immediately. So, Mr. Pierce, obviously you, have covered a lot of miles in this area. These sort of retaliatory measures that, or certainly, apparent retaliatory measures. How do we respond to this? I mean, obviously we passed the PRO Act here in the House, but in terms of just sort of with the tools that the NLRB has, maybe you could just sort of comment in terms of just what you're seeing with incidents like in Connecticut and Maine.
Well, when you look at Maine, the insidious nature of the Maine situation is you have a place that gets closed as soon as a petition gets filed after employees were being trained to expand operations at that facility. And then they offer up jobs to the public at a location 40 minutes away, but block the emails of those employees that were working at the closed facilities from applying. That kind of devastating, diabolical activity has to be looked at very carefully. The law talks about an employer has a right to shutter its business to stop a union from coming in. But if you have a corporate employer that has a cluster of business and is essentially playing whack-a-mole to drive out the union, I think the law looks a little bit differently at those kind of activities, and it'll be interesting to see what the unfair labor practice will result.
Again, just in terms of legal process at the NLRB, the ranking members, question about allegations made by Starbucks, regarding what they described as their, what they perceive as unfair labor practices. Certainly, the Inspector General is an important player in our system of laws, and we certainly, I think, welcome any input that they may have. However, it's not like Starbucks didn't have other options here, which is if they really felt that there was something amiss, I mean, they could have had this issue flushed out at the NLRB itself. I mean, there's ways that you can raise these questions Isn't that correct?
Oh, yes. The normal course of action would be to file a complaint with the Inspector General, provided that you have some kind of proof to back it up. It begs the question when Starbucks announces that a undisclosed employee divulged that this kind of so-called collusion was taking place, and they divulged this to Starbucks rather than themselves making the complaint to the Inspector General. I smell something foul there. Additionally, and this is an important point, if there is true collusion between the NLRB and Starbucks, it's interesting that in the wake of these bold accusations, the NLRB was successful in getting an injunction to get the Memphis 7 employees reinstated because of the egregious nature of the activity that Starbucks has. It calls into question whether or not the allegation is that the District Court of the United States was part of this collusion. I think not.
Well, thank you, sir. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. King, as you know, Indiana is a right-to-work state. And since right-to-work was enacted in 2012, the Mackinac Center for Public Policy recently noted that since that time, they noted in the Wall Street Journal that manufacturing jobs as a share of total jobs in Indiana's private sector has increased by 27%. That seems significant to me. Can you talk about the benefits of that to workers in Indiana, more manufacturing jobs as a result of right-to-work laws, and what else have, and what other ways have workers benefited from right-to-work laws in states like my state, Indiana?
Well, Indiana is like 26 other states, Congressman, you're right, that have right-to-work statutes. And the electorate in your state and those other 26 states have decided that that's the policy they want to have for Indiana. And the economic benefits, as you've just stated, are obvious. Now, you can argue back and forth about right-to-work status, but what we are hearing is that employees want a choice. They don't want to be forced into paying fees or dues to any organization, whether it be a union or any other third-party organization. They don't want that third party spending their money for social causes, political causes that they don't agree with. They want flexibility, and flexibility seems to be one of the key attraction points for qualified workers. And Indiana has done an excellent job of attracting qualified workers, and employers want to go where there are qualified workers. So the Hoosier State is a perfect example of success in this area.
But it's not just, I think you would agree, it's not just a matter of fairness. Increase of 27% manufacturing jobs since that period of time seems as if there are a lot more good paying jobs available to workers in my state, as I'm sure is the case in the 27 other right-to-work states around the country as well. So there's a benefit here to workers, to families, financially as well. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. Why shouldn't the electorate of your state or any state decide this question? The PRO Act, as you know, Congressman, would effectively eliminate right-to-work laws. That shouldn't be coming from the halls of Congress. The people in the respective states like Indiana should be able to make that decision.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Mr. King, could you talk for a minute about what grounds states like Indiana might have to challenge the PRO Act if it did, God forbid, get passed and signed into law by the president? Would states like Indiana have legal grounds to challenge that law?
I'm not sure about the state per se, Congressman, but I think employers within the state certainly would have standing. And let me give you an example. The prohibition on employers having a right to communicate in a meeting their views on unionization. And let's be clear on this point. The testimony here this morning seems to suggest that a so-called captive audience speech, which is an incorrect term, by the way, somehow can brainwash employees. That sells the American worker short. They're much more sophisticated. Ms. Essen is a perfect example. They can make their own decisions. They're not in a half an hour meeting going to be so brainwashed that they can't make an intelligent decision about unions and its consequences. What this is all about is stopping the employer for having any type of communication. The minute that employee walks out of that meeting, and these meetings are paid for, by the way, timed by the employer, she or he is going to go online, talk to fellow workers, and make their own decision. This is a total subterfuge. It's an impediment of free speech. But also, notwithstanding the 8C violation that would be, I think, legally cognizable, the PRO Act prohibits an employer from having any involvement in a representation proceeding. That's a due process violation. Again, it's an effort here to cut off free speech, cut off communication. And irrespective of how you feel about politics in general, when anyone's trying to talk about cutting off speech, having communication, having an ability to exchange ideas back and forth, that's suspect. And that's what's happening.
Very well put. Thank you for your time. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. According to the National Labor Relations Board, Connecticut has seen an 18% increase in union election petitions, lower than the national average. However, Connecticut has also seen a 35% increase in unfair labor practice charges, well above the national average. Over the past several months, workers across my district at Fuel Cell Energy in Danbury, Durham School Services in Waterbury, and registered nurses at Sharon Hospital have filed for union elections. I've heard reports that the hospital in my district is pulling nurses during their shift to go to meetings that discourage unionizing. Dr. Bronfenbrenner, your most recent data shows that where employers choose to run anti-union campaigns, 74% brought in one or more management consultants to run the campaigns. While outright union busting is illegal, these management consultants often have the same aims. What recourse is there for workers who see their employer bringing on management consultants with a reputation for union suppression?
Management consultants have become basically universal in the organizing process, and they tell the company how to run the campaign, and basically once they're in there, they are in charge of everything. Productivity, profits take second. The number one priority is getting rid of the union. Workers are faced with this, the fact that they really have no say whether management consultants are present or not, but also that even though management consultants are required to register under the LMRDA, that many of them don't. A recent study found that in 2021, when there were over 1,216 elections, that a very small percentage of the management consultants actually registered of any of the forms. And with that, unions can't and workers can't find out who they are, how much money they're spending, and whether they're violating the law. And even if they are found to have violated the law, we do not have a single case where they are charged with criminal penalties or financial penalties. This is in great contrast to unions who, in violation of the LMRDA, are very often charged with huge fines and criminal penalties. So there is no enforcement. The only thing that workers can do is talk to other workers in other workplaces and try to find the practices of these management consultants to be prepared ahead of time what unfair labor practices they're going to commit in their workplace.
Thank you. When an employee gets fired for union organizing activity, their case before NLRB proceeds while they are out of the job. Workers sometimes wait months for temporary reinstatement. Mr. Pierce, is it a problem that NLRB must file for an injunction when the union violates the law, but does not have to when an employer fires a pro-union employee?
It is definitely an inequity in the process. As you stated, if a union engages in an illegal strike, the general counsel is mandated to go and seek an injunction. When an employer engages in wiping out a bargaining unit by firing all of the union activists, there has to be a petitioning by the people bringing the charges to the regional office to have 10J proceedings considered. That evaluation has to be done at the regional level. The region makes requests to the general counsel, who then makes a request to the board before an injunction could even proceed. All of that is time and labor intensive. And then once that happens, it has to go to a district court. And the district court judge makes a determination as to whether or not an injunction is appropriate.
Thank you so much for that, sir. My last question is for Ms. Eisen. People make life decisions based on their health care, when to retire, when to change jobs, oftentimes when to buy a home. Do you believe that threatening essential health benefits has deterred employees from wanting to unionize?
I think it's bred a lot of fear into employees that would like to unionize, and fear is very, very powerful. Fear is not only a product of union busting, in most cases, it's the intent. So employers are trying to scare their employees into making a decision one way or another. That's not the way that this should work.
Thank you so much. I just will end by saying I've worked for an employer where we had the choice to vote for a union and I voted no. And I've worked for an employer where we have the choice to vote for a union and I voted yes. All that to say, leave it up to the employees to take a vote. Present your best argument and let the employees take a vote on what is best for them. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. My distinguished colleague from Virginia, Mr. Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry you're not here with me to greet you in person. As someone who worked in a unionized auto factory in college, I saw firsthand the major problems with unions, protecting the disgruntled or unproductive workers, reducing productivity, increasing costs, creating an unhealthy us versus them relationship with management, and et cetera. As a matter of fact, I worked there 34 years ago, and they paid me what was then an exorbitant $11 an hour rate as a college kid. And they actually put me in a supervisory role over these lazy union employees who weren't doing their jobs, quite frankly, because of my work ethic. And that might be why the plant closed not long after I left there. Biden promised that he would be the most pro-union president in history, and like his war on reliable energy, he has kept that promise as well. Perhaps this is because the union spent over $27 million to help him during the 2020 campaign. But today represents the classic Democrat response to everything, and yet another example of their anti-freedom, pro-government control approach to every issue. Force you to get a vaccine, force you to wear a mask, force you to close your business or your church, force you to close your school, force you to buy and drive an electric vehicle, force you to embrace their values on transgender, marriage, sexualization of kids, and so forth. Hey, Mom. Force you to pay for everyone else's abortions, force you to pay for everyone else's student loans, force your kids into the one government school in your district, force you to pay more in taxes, regulation, and of course inflation. Hey, maybe we should have an inflation celebration. Oh wait, we did that yesterday. Force you to join a union and pay union dues, force you to embrace a union or close your business, which is what the PRO Act would do, force you to embrace a union or close your business. The priorities of unions were on full display these past couple of years, where the teachers' unions colluded with the Biden administration to shut down our schools at the expense of our children. These lockdowns, we all know now, has cost decades of progress for our kids, especially minority students, and we've seen the greatest decline in test scores in 30 years as a result of the teachers' unions closing of our schools. And that's why I introduced the Students Before Unions Act, which would ensure that students are the priority and not unions. Mr. King, do you think that the best interests of students are served by teachers' unions? Do you think that the students are their number one priority, the interests of students for teachers' unions?
Certainly debatable. The closure of schools, even some union proponents I now am reading think that was a mistake. We are years behind, I'm reading recently, in education areas, math and science, because we missed these teaching opportunities, and online can only do so much. That interactivity in person between teacher and student is critical. So I think this country is unfortunately going to suffer for decades, perhaps because of these closures. I want to interject one point, Mr. Good. The recent colloquy between the congressman and Ms. Essen, you had an opportunity to vote, and that is so important. I couldn't agree with you more. I'm glad you voted.
That's right.
So we want to preserve that right. But back to your question, Mr. Good, we need to take a step back and think about practicalities here. Not every ounce of intelligence comes from these halls, unfortunately, and I used to work here and have a great admiration for the Congress. We've got to pay more attention to reality in this country and have connectivity with the worker and how she or he believes, and not force anything upon them against their will. That's not the way we should proceed.
You're exactly right. I think perhaps the most underappreciated in terms of its danger and its damage to the country piece of legislation we have voted on in the House has been the PRO Act, which would essentially, again, tell a business, embrace a union, because you have no ability to resist it whatsoever, force a union upon your workers, force them to pay for a union, irrespective of what their wishes or what might be best for that company, which would be terribly damaging, terribly harmful to the country and to the nation's productivity. What, 58% of Americans say they're not interested in joining a labor union. Right. There's a reason why labor unionization has decreased across the country. Mr. King, how is it appropriate for the federal government to be involved in efforts to increase union membership anyway? How's that appropriate for the federal government to be involved with that?
Well, it's quite suspect. I certainly appreciate and can understand President Biden's position. He has a right to make that policy decision, but what is wrong is you do not then have executive agencies, particularly the National Labor Relations Board, take one side or the other on the issue of union representation or unfair labor practice charges. We've heard a lot of testimony here today about the budget of the NLRB. Well, what's not been said is that the caseload of the NLRB went down drastically in the stats I have in my testimony. So the workload for the board over the years has decreased. It's debatable how much money, if any additional money, they need. But back to the basic point here, the PRO Act is so one-sided. For example, it provides for fines for employers and employer executives, but a rogue union, and there are some inappropriate union activities, there's no fine whatsoever. There's no provision to curtail that kind of activity. The secondary boycott provision is a drastic policy mistake. Why should you involve a neutral employer and its employees, and they could be union, in a dispute that a union has with another company? That's going to decrease economic productivity, perhaps put that employer out of business. That intervention in the secondary boycott area is a tragic mistake in that legislation. And I could go on. It's so one-sided, it's so tilted. And I would venture a guess that many members of Congress in this body that voted for it have no idea what they voted for.
Our time has expired. The chairman is saying that's a pretty heavy thumb on the scale from the government, but thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sonier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope you're feeling well. I am reminded when I attend hearings like this of a quote by a Republican president during the largest expansion of the American economy in history, when 1 in 3 workers were members of unions. President Eisenhower said that only a fool would deprive an American man or woman worker from joining a union of their choice. So Professor Brunfenbrunner, and I emphasize with any last name that's more than 3 syllables, could you talk to me a little bit about the importance of the PRO Act in the context of inequality in this country and the disparity of influence between wage earners and capital investors? During COVID, when we seem to be all in it together to help employers and help employees get through this period, we now have research that inequality got even worse. So Eisenhower was able to get to that period because we learned, in my view, from the last great inequality period between wages and capital, the Gilded Age. So the PRO Act to me is incredibly important to begin to level the playing field. And it's encouraging to see that Americans are starting to understand the importance, whether they are in a union or not, the importance of workers having a voice through union membership. Professor, could you respond to that, particularly the importance of the PRO Act to help with inequality?
There's been a lot of talk about secret ballot elections, and I want to say that right now there is no such thing as a secret ballot because employers can engage in interrogation, surveillance, monitoring of their employees, so they know exactly which way workers are going to vote at the time of the election. The PRO Act is needed to make sure that workers who want unions can choose unions, and workers who don't want unions don't have to choose unions, to make sure the process is free and fair, which it is not right now. But in terms of, we also know that unionization, the decline of union density has had a direct correlation with increase in inequality in multiple fronts. Union workers are not just better paid, but union workers are more likely to have access to the legal process, which is that if you have a collective bargaining agreement, you can enforce employment and labor laws that can take decades to get enforced under our current legal system because civil litigation comes second to criminal litigation. There is less discrimination in union workplaces, but also unions have played a major role in our society in pushing for legislation that benefits all workers, union workers and non-union workers, whether it's anti-discrimination laws, minimum wage laws, health and safety laws, and if there's a weak labor movement, then we're less likely to get the kind of laws that benefit all workers. Finally, we have to understand that unions play a role in our society in terms of improving education, in terms of improving healthcare, and access to protections in the workplace. If you do not have a strong labor movement, all of these factors decline. Thank you.
And one of the most disturbing things coming out of COVID again is this continued disparity between wage earners and investors. Nothing against investment. As Lincoln said, you need to have a balance between labor and capital. And if you don't, you've lost democracy. So one of the really concerning things is research that shows that there's a diminishing consumer class, that actually the top 1% is driving the economy based on consuming within the top 1%, people who make over $7 million in investments a year. Care to comment?
One of the biggest driving forces of the organizing surge has been that workers have seen in the last decade their wages stagnate. At the same time that the top 1% has had incredible growth in profit, and it meant they're taking home. During COVID, workers felt that they weren't just taking cuts in their wages and their benefits, but they were also risking their lives. And when they went to their employers to ask for PPE or paid leave time, these same corporations that were making money hand over fist during the pandemic said, no, we can't afford that. And that was the driving force. Workers don't come to work to die, they come to work to work. And that was the driving force between not only all the organizing, but the strike wave that we had.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Keller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I must admit, I'm a little baffled here that we think the individuals that employ so many Americans, the people we represent, are bad people. That's not the people I represent. They care about the people that come to work in their businesses. And they want to take care of them because they know they're valuable members of their team. I know that from when I worked in a factory. And I didn't need the middleman to help me communicate to the people and to the organization for which I was part. But it seems like not everybody shares that opinion, and I guess they must think that the people they represent aren't good people. That's not my experience. And I just want to, say, inflation continues to hammer employees and job creators in Pennsylvania. The Consumer Price Index has indicated that inflation numbers rose 8.3% from August 2021 to August 2022. And our economic outlook is getting worse each day. We talk about earnings. The policies of the Biden administration and Democrats have taken 1 month's salary, 1 month's earnings of America's workers over the last year with 8.3% inflation. Yet, House Democrats and the Biden administration seem more determined than ever to implement the harmful provisions of the PRO Act, a radical change to our labor laws that would benefit union bosses at the expense of workers and further worsen the economic challenges we face. Workers need to be able to decide for themselves if they want to seek union membership or not. It isn't the government's job to make these decisions for them. Mr. King, Democrats have long desired to eliminate workers' right to secret ballot elections. The latest attempt is to pressure the NLRB to implement online voting for union representation. Like card check, online voting provides no privacy guarantees and invites voter intimidation and coercion. Why is the right to a secret ballot election so important for workers?
Mr. Keller, it has so many consequences. If a union is voted in, that union, in all probability, will stay at that place of employment for decades until that location either merges or closes. There's no reoccurring vote like we have for members of Congress, for example, whether the union continues. So it's a very permanent type of decision that impacts that worker's life, whether they pay dues or fees, whether they have to go out on strike, whether they support their union with respect to political and other types of social movement contributions. It impacts so many things over such a long period of time that it's a very serious decision, and that decision should only be made by a secret ballot vote, a colloquy we just had. The Congresswoman had an opportunity to vote. That is critical, a secret ballot vote. And electronic voting, you mentioned, I don't understand what the objective is. We have high voter turnout under very good circumstances right now by the National Labor Relations Board. They do an excellent job of that. I am yet to understand what the real objective is, if any, other than maybe to decrease voter participation and only have certain segments of the voter population participate. That's not good. We want everyone involved.
Thank you. Also, Mr. King, the PRO Act allows the NLRB to impose civil penalties of up to $100,000 on employers that commit unfair labor practices and states that the board shall consider the gross income of the employer in imposing the fine. Does that mean that a company could be required to pay a fine of up to $100,000 even in a year that it loses money overall?
Apparently so. It's another example of the ill-conceived provisions in the PRO Act. This legislation, if it were to become law, is so tilted in favor of one side. There is no provision, as I mentioned just previously, for any fines whatsoever on rogue union activity. It's a totally one-sided approach. It's unfortunate it's even gotten this far in the discussion in this country. And friends of mine in the union movement, if they're honest with me, and they are in off-the-record discussions, they readily concede that many of these provisions are ill-advised.
Yeah, I would talk about some of the union pension plans that we've had to bail out and subsidize with taxpayer expense too. So we want to talk about bad actors. I think we shouldn't be forcing people to join unions. I think we should allow them to make that decision on their own. So
And Mr. Keller, I just want to say one thing before we close. You said at the outset of your remarks, people in your district, 94% of the American population, I think as you know, does not work under a union contract. They're not second-class citizens, and their employers are not bad employers. So yes, we may have some bad employer actors in this country, but let's not diminish the value of these people are providing for our country.
The people that take the risk every day, right? And that's the whole team. That's the team, and I think the thing that's important. The people I represent are good people, and they work hard, and they don't need the government interfering with the relationship between themselves and their employer. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I hope that you will be back with us sound and safe soon. I just wanted to start out my comments by reminding my colleague that union members are employees themselves. It is not some strange entity that exists outside of that, and I hope that you also recognize that you do represent the employees who are members of those unions. And as a former union member myself, who has gone on strike and relied on the collective strength of my union, I stand behind all of those who fight for fair and safe workplaces. And I'm proud to say that Minnesota has one of the largest increases in union activity in the country this year, including multiple Starbucks locations in my district. Dr. Pranvenbreder, in your testimony, you stated that the pandemic, combined with skyrocketing corporate profits and an increasing tight labor markets, created a hot shop condition for union organizing. But even for organized workers, responding to the pandemic has been critical, especially in the healthcare industry. Right now, 15,000 nurses in Minnesota are currently undertaking the largest strike of private sector nurses in US history and probably globally. These workers have been heavily impacted by severe staffing shortages and it has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, and they certainly aren't the only workplace that is facing this unique and escalating concern due to the ongoing pandemic. Workers also never want to go on strike, but when employers refuse to negotiate over improving wages and conditions, workers are often left without a choice. Can you speak to the rise in strike activity over the past year and what this activity says about how workers perceive employer behavior at the bargaining table?
Thank you for that question. The strike activity, there's not just been a dramatic increase in organizing activity, there's been a dramatic increase in strike activity. In 2021, the upsurge gained extensive attention. There were 265 work stoppages involving 140,000 workers. And in the first 8 months of 2022, there have been 267 strikes in 393 different locations. A third of those strikes were unorganized workers striking for not just the right to organize, but over health and safety conditions. Manufacturing and educational services accounted for the majority of total work stoppages, 17.7% each, but also healthcare accounted for the largest number of the overall strikers. Across the country, workers are striking over health and safety, racial justice, scheduling, and deteriorating working conditions. COVID escalated strike activity because of the overwhelming number of workers who felt that they were not able to work in a safe workplace during COVID, especially all the essential workers.
Dr. Pierce, Mr. Pierce, for decades, the NLRP has interpreted Section 8C as permitting captive audience meetings. Ms. Eason testified to the numerous captive audience meetings duped as listening sessions that baristas had to attend, which ultimately had a powerful effect in intimidating workers. The current general counsel is seeking to change this precedent. Can you explain how the current interpretation is going beyond the speech protected by Section 8C and why it's actually extremely coercive?
Well, the speeches that, as Ms. Eisen has testified, are speeches that employees are forced to listen to. And the fact that they're couched as voluntary is a misnomer if the employees will not be able to continue to get paid if they don't attend. Other people on this panel, Mr. King in particular, has talked about how 8C requires the employer to have free speech. What is being overlooked is that the statute also says that employees have a right to refrain, and they have a right to refrain from engaging in union activity in engaging in anti-union activity, which would include propaganda. And that is where the General Counsel is going, I believe.
Wonderful, appreciate that. And I think that part is really important because no one is forcing anyone to be part of a union. And we are certainly just pushing to make sure that people have the right to vote for one if they want and not to vote for one if they want. And obviously organizing is part of the activity of getting people involved, which is what Starbucks workers and others across this country, and especially in my district, are doing. That's the right we want to preserve. That is a right that exists in this country and should continue to exist. Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Next on my list is the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you. And a question for Mr. King. Mr. King, in regards to the PRO Act, as I read provisions of that act, I'm from Buffalo, New York. I served on the Buffalo School Board for years. As I read provisions in the PRO Act, one thing that really looks to me very similar to the provision that we have for some of our public employees in New York State, the Triborough Amendment under New York State's Taylor Law, which the state law governing public sector labor relations, terms and conditions of a contract stay in place, even if the contract is expired and workers and management haven't settled on a new deal. This law is one of the main contributors, in my mind, to New York's State's extremely high tax burden, highest in the country, and removes any incentive often for public sector unions to compromise. And I've seen this quite a bit in our contract negotiations with the Buffalo Teachers Federation. We, for a long time, did not have a contract because of the fact that the deal that had been negotiated in the past was so good that there was really no incentive for the union to get back to the negotiating table. They were still getting incremental raises. They had lifetime health care. And in the Buffalo Teacher Federation contract, they had free cosmetic surgery. And that cosmetic surgery rider kept going up and up and up because providers were realizing that they had a gold mine of activity, and they were popping up more facilities to provide cosmetic surgery for our teachers. It got to be over $13 million a year, and we had to pay a lot to get that out of the contract because it just kept going and going. My concern is the PRO Act will do that throughout private union negotiations and really tip the scale on the ability to have fair bargaining. I just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yes, I do. The points you made are very important practical points. The union particularly will have little or no incentive in a first contract situation to reach an agreement and then force, as the PRO Act would, a government-imposed arbitration panel of 3 arbitrators who will write the contract for the parties, and the employer and the union will have limited input in how that contract is written. So, and I've negotiated contracts, Congressman, for over 45 years. So if the other party doesn't have an incentive to reach a deal doesn't get done. And under the PRO Act, then it moves to this government intervention arbitration process. It's ill-advised, it's not needed, and these are first contracts that are critical for the relationship between the parties. As you mentioned, all kinds of provisions can be included. And the subject areas that the so-called arbitrators are to look at are very subjective, and this is an ill-advised policy approach. There are other ways to deal with first contract situations, which I'd be happy to opine on. But this is a very deficient part of this proposal.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to just comment on what I referenced in terms of my experience in the Buffalo School Board. What really frustrated me is one, the amount of funds that would be taken out from the core purpose of that institution, which was educating children. But also the fact is we had a situation where all the union negotiators were retired. What the laying things in place the way they had it and not negotiating a new contract benefited those at the higher end of the scale, but it really left us in a position where we were incapable of enhancing salaries for teachers that were just coming into the system. And it was much harder to encourage them to come into the system and reward them for serving in an urban school district. So it really hurts a lot of the employees as well, this type of structure. With that, I will yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Chairman, for holding this hearing, and to all of the witnesses for being here today. Unions built the middle class, and they built this country. But for decades, the right of workers to organize for higher wages, better benefits, and safer working conditions have been under attack from corporate interests and their right-wing allies. Our future depends on a robust and thriving middle class. And that starts with protecting the rights of workers to organize. As a steadfast supporter of organized labor, I was proud to support the Protecting the Right to Organize, or PRO Act, which, as you all know, passed the House in early 2021, but has yet to pass the United States Senate. Since passage in the House, we have seen record-breaking approval ratings of unions and organizing efforts by workers across the country. Over 640 unions won representation elections, the highest number of victories we've seen in 17 years. However, this is not enough. I urge my Senate colleagues to do their part to hold corporations accountable for illegal union busting tactics. I urge my Senate colleagues to join this body in passing the PRO Act. It is past time to update our labor laws so that unions can organize without fear of intimidation by their employers and negotiate in a timely manner. One reason why companies like Starbucks can withstand a high degree of scrutiny from the NLRB is because of statutory weaknesses in the NLRB's procedures, which fail to deter repeat violations. Another reason companies flout the NLRB's oversight is because current law permits employers to hold captive audience meetings and use other intimidation tactics. Ms. Eisen, in your written testimony, you mentioned that Starbucks subjected you and other employees to at least 5 listening sessions, that the company sent about 7 new untrained staff members to the Elmwood store, and that the company assigned up to 3 so-called support managers per shift. One of these support managers was the president of Starbucks North America. In your 11 years with the company, did you ever encounter such high-level officials in your stores? And moreover, how did their presence in conjunction with the other intimidation tactics impact your effectiveness as an employee and your overall well-being?
Thank you for that question. No, in my 11 years with the company, the highest person I'd ever even seen come through our market was a regional director, and I think that was maybe twice in the 11 years I'd worked for the company. So hosting folks as high up the ladder as the president of Starbucks North America, who I would say we didn't host, she relocated to Buffalo for 5 months during our organizing campaign. As far as how it affected our mental health and our even physical health, we had a couple of Starbucks workers at the Elmwood location that were high school seniors, children, actual children working at the store. One of them confided in me that they had been calling off their shifts not long into the organizing campaign because they couldn't take the stress of coming in and having to feel like they were under a microscope. It's a high volume store, and it's a very can be a very difficult job to do. It's hard enough when you're dealing with the public on a regular basis, especially in the middle of a global pandemic, but now you have to do it with someone who's making $4 million a year breathing down your neck. It's inappropriate, it's scary, and it shouldn't be allowed to happen.
I agree. After the Supreme Court issued its decision in Dobbs, the Jackson Women's Health Organization, which overturned the constitutional fundamental right to abortion in this country, Starbucks announced that its healthcare plan would cover abortion-related travel for employees, but that it could not promise that to workers in union stores. In attempting to leverage the Supreme Court's assault on women's rights for the purpose of an anti-union campaign, Starbucks appears to pretend that it has to deny medical benefits to union workers. Based on your interactions with the company, does anything actually prevent Starbucks from offering union workers coverage for abortion-related travel?
It does not. The unionized stores, waived their right to bargain over the new improved benefits. Starbucks likes to use the law as a reason for not being able to offer us those benefits, but the reality is that if the union waives the right to bargain over those, the only thing preventing Starbucks from giving those unionized workers those benefits is because Starbucks doesn't want to.
It is a nefarious tactic to dangle Dobbs over workers, to make them feel like they have to choose between their rights to healthcare and to organize. And the fact that Starbucks and other corporations continue to employ these illegal practices is why the Senate needs to pass the PRO Act now. I yield.
Thank you. Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Cawthorn. Is he not there?
I'm here, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Oh, good, okay.
Mr. Chairman, wish you a really speedy recovery from your COVID. Let me see
Thank you.
here. Mr. King, thank you for being with us today. I appreciate your testimony and shining a light on the anti-business and prone union bias of this committee's Democrat majority. My question today regards the assault on independent contracting that the majority is contemplating today. An assault that could prove damaging to the pursuit of the American dream for many people. And I have a two-part question for you, Mr. King. When California was debating the same idea, the pro-union forces ignored the arguments that curbing independent contracting would disproportionately affect minorities. In fact, the California Black Chamber of Commerce issued a fiery statement saying, among other things, that the gig economy has become the gateway to independence and self-employment for African Americans. Unlike anything seen since the golden age of Black entrepreneurship, they concluded with this line: efforts by the California politicians to shut the gig economy down in the name of protecting Black workers is the same as burning down a city built with our own dreams to save us from ourselves. My first question, Mr. King, is, as minority groups continue to be among the communities hardest hit by this sluggish economy and Biden inflation, how will destroying independent contracting affect these communities?
Adversely. It's not a good policy decision. And I want to interject here. Of course, the voters in California rejected AB 5, Assembly Bill 5, which was essentially the independent contractor approach. So the people of California, even their so-called red state status, have looked at this issue and have said no. Apparently, here in Congress, that voice hasn't been heard. But back to your question, minorities, disadvantaged individuals in a community often have as their first job working for a franchisee, working for a small business entity, becoming an independent contractor, and working for a variety of different employers. Why should we penalize that? Why should we interfere with that? I think the answer is clearly no, and the PRO Act, of course, goes, as you mentioned, the wrong way, and it really diminishes the definition, narrows the definition of where we should go in this area.
Well, thank you, Mr. King. Now, swiftly shifting gears, I have a second question. You note in your testimony that adopting this ABC test proved problematic for California bureaucrats. What do you think the outlook would be on adopting this sort of test nationally without extensive carve-outs for the politically well-connected?
Well, AB 5 and the PRO Act incorporation of it into the National Labor Relations Act is going to attempt, at least, to make every individual in the workplace an employee. And the objective is clear here. Therefore, if the individual is an employee, the union can organize them and have them be part of a collective bargaining unit. It really disregards the flexibility, the independence, and the decision-making of the worker. And it takes us in the wrong policy direction. It's really disturbing. It, again, is another attack on the franchisor-franchisee system in this country that has generated hundreds of thousands of jobs. There is no reason or rationale for it on a sound policy basis.
Well, Mr. King, I only have about 1 minute and 13 seconds left. And so my last question will be, do you believe that unions sometimes forcibly collect fees from non-union employees to be steered for a political agenda that that employee does not agree with?
Well, unfortunately, it happens on a recurring basis. And the polling data, and I mentioned this earlier today, the polling data clearly shows that workers don't want that type of extraction of their money to go to social causes, political causes they don't agree with. And that's one of the reasons that unions are having difficulty, I submit, in convincing workers that a union is in their best interest. The worker today is intelligent, thoughtful. I keep hearing this suggestion on questions that a employer-employee meeting is somehow going to poison their minds. That denigrates the intelligence level of the American worker. And a half an hour meeting, they're not going to be poisoned on how they believe about a union. They'll go out and seek their own information. But back to the basic essence of your question, the worker today wants to be independent, wants to have a voice, wants to decide for herself or himself without having any restrictions imposed upon them.
Excellent. Well, Mr. King, thank you very much to all of our witnesses. Thank you to Ranking Member Fox. Thank you for your leadership, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Bowman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also want to wish you a speedy recovery from COVID. My question is from Ms. Eisen. Ms. Eisen, thank you so much for joining us here today and for your immense organizing work. Just sending you strength and love, and please keep up the fight. I wanted to mention that, as we know, over the last several decades, we've seen a decrease in unions and unions being consistently under attack. And we have a nation that struggles with wealth inequality as well as unemployment and underemployment. Can you speak a little bit about why unionizing is essential to our democracy and a more equitable society? And how have you seen that manifest in your work?
Well, I think to start, I'd like to dispel some of the counterpoints that say that the bulk of the workers are not in favor of unionization. The Starbucks organizing campaign has a 75% win rate. Of the 240 elections, 56 of those were unanimous, and many others were at least a 2/3 majority. So the workers' voices are being heard, and they're saying that they are wanting to unionize. In terms of how equitable unions can help make these workplaces, a personal example would be my own wages at Starbucks after 11 years. At the start of our campaign, I was making just 16 cents more an hour than someone who was hired the day before we went public with our campaign. So you're looking at a company that can certainly afford to invest in their long-term employees and show that they're valued, and chooses not to in favor of making the bottom line seem more impressive to its shareholders. With unionization, we have the ability to talk about things like seniority pay, and to reward those employees for their loyalty. And quite frankly, that was one of our talking points from the very beginning of our campaign. And just mere weeks before our vote at Elmwood, the company all of a sudden announced that after 50 years, they were going to implement a seniority pay.
Thank you for that response. I also want to respond to a comment that was made earlier about teachers unions being responsible for closing schools and hurting student learning. First and foremost, the decision was made across many parts of the country to close schools to make sure our students and our teachers remain safe, sound, secure, and alive as we dealt with a global pandemic. And I want to mention that it was the Democratic Party and President Biden and this committee that helped to pass the American Rescue Plan that sent historic investments to public schools across the country and allowed them to open back up safely. As we talk about student learning and setbacks to student learning, teachers unions have consistently been at the forefront of curriculum design and development that have contributed to student learning and growth over many years. And a singular test score is not the only measure of that. And being a former middle school principal and educator for 20 years, I can speak personally to the growth of my students in my Bronx school related to the union and I was a part of as a principal's union, as well as being a part of a teacher's union. My next question is for Dr. Brennan. I want to focus for a moment on the care economy. I'm really proud that the largest worker-owned cooperative in the country, Cooperative Home Care Associates, is in the Bronx and has seen significant success in improving job quality and quality of care for many of my constituents through its unionized, worker-owned democratic structure. Can you talk to the benefits of union representation paired with other forms of democratic workplace structures such as worker-owned cooperatives? And how can Congress support and empower workers to learn about and participate in these types of arrangements?
The primary reason that healthcare workers organize is over quality of care. They believe that the companies they work for are not doing enough in terms of providing good quality care, and they, as nurses, home care workers, technicians, feel very concerned that they are not doing the best they can by their patients. The workers need a voice because workers know best what's happening on the day-to-day level with the patients they serve. And unionized workplaces have been shown to have higher quality health care than non-union workplaces. It is essential that workers have the ability to express that voice and have a say in the conditions of their employment. We need, whether the workers try to do cooperative relationships or union relationships, currently we find that employer opposition is particularly high in healthcare. It historically has been. The beginning of the management consultant movement actually came after in the 70s after healthcare workers were added to the National Labor Relations Act. And so the fight to unionize and be able to raise the quality of healthcare in the workplace is a high priority, which would passing the PRO Act would greatly benefit because it would restrict the kind of employer opposition that is restraining so many workers from organizing. We also have to remember that.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I have to cut you off. My time is expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2015, the National Labor Relations Board, comprised entirely of President Obama's appointees, created a broad definition of joint employment that put the franchise model at risk and threatened to erode small business owners' control of their operations. This action cost franchise businesses $33.3 billion per year and prevented the creation of 376,000 jobs between 2015 and 2020. Recently, we saw the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division rescind the narrowly tailored joint employment rulemaking published under the Trump administration. Now, at a time of soaring prices and House Democrats printing money left and right, the Biden administration has decided now is the perfect time to release a proposed rulemaking, reverting once again to the harmful Obama-era joint employment definition. Reversing the previous administration's actions has once again upended business owners' stability and authority over setting the essential terms of employment for their employees. Time and time again, those on the other side of the aisle have trampled on the rights of small business owners and failed to provide clarity for businesses and employees. Mr. King, how would the joint employer definition outlined in the PRO Act further damage the potential of our nation's small business owners and franchisees?
It'd be very harmful. What it does, Mr. Comer, is it would incorporate into the National Labor Relations Act this very broad definition that makes virtually one employer a joint employer with anybody else. And it would severely impact the franchisee-franchisor relationship. A franchisee in your district that is a small independent business person employing many people in your community is not a joint employer with a large corporate franchisor. Exactly. And the key here is to try to put pressure on the franchisor, to put pressure on their franchisee to not resist in any way, shape, or form union activity. It's a clear push-down, top-down pressure point.
Absolutely. I would make the case that your response is exactly why my legislation, the Save Local Business Act, is essential, and I think the 93 organizations endorsing it would agree. Congress must codify a tailored, consistent joint employer standard to prevent infringement from government bureaucrats on our nation's entrepreneurs and job creators. Now, speaking of rising barriers to growing industries, we have clearly seen within the rail industry over the last several weeks that unionization, no matter if it's in public or private workplaces, inevitably leads to a slowdown in productivity. The continued negotiations between unions and national rail companies had led to the removal of certain products from rail lines like fertilizer, critical to American farmers. The eventual increase in prices because of the union demands and threatened work stoppages will cost American consumers at the pump and at the register. As Americans are paying dearly for bloated congressional spending, corn and soybeans will be rotting on rail cars, building materials already in scarce supply will be stuck far from the projects for which they were intended, and chemicals and aluminum produced in my district in Kentucky will remain loaded on stationary cars. This brings back images of boycotts and strikes that deeply damaged industries, particularly agriculture, in the 1930s and 40s. The PRO Act would make such stopgaps a regular occurrence and further strain our already fragile supply chains. Now, Mr. King, can you provide some insight into the economic damage such strikes, which will inevitably result from the PRO Act, will have on American consumers' cost of living?
Mr. Comer, the PRO Act would permit intermittent strikes, which can be even more damaging than a long-term strike. The PRO Act would permit interference with employer operations. It would prohibit employers from hiring either temporary or permanent replacements, but yet permit the union to go out on strike. Employers have a right to operate their businesses in this country. Unions have a right to strike, but it's got to be equal. The Rail Act is of great concern. Mr. Comer, my trade association represents most of the Fortune 400 companies in the country. We've already heard from a number of them saying they're going to have to shut down plants if the rail strike occurs. But it's not just big business. As you mentioned, it's the farmer, it's the small business, it's the entire economy. People come here and testify, and they think strikes are good. They talk about Striketober. They're very damaging to this country, and that's an offshoot of this adversarial process that at least some unions have instituted in this country. Very harmful.
Right. I agree, and thank you so much for your testimony. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And at this point, we'll take a 5-minute break. And if you can start the timer right now, we'll reconvene in 5 minutes. And next up will be Mrs. Manning, and then Mr. Castro on our side. Ms. Manning becomes available.
Bobby, I think we're ready.
Okay, we're waiting. The next person on our side is Mrs. Manning, who does not appear to be available right now. Mr. Castro would be next.
We have two members on the floor, in the room, if you want to recognize one of them to save time, because I think we're going to get called to vote.
Okay. Do you have members on your side ready to, what is Ms. Manning? Ms. Manning, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for hanging in there with us. I'd like to start with Ms. Eisen. Ms. Eisen, your store managed to successfully unionize despite facing the significant opposition that you detailed in your testimony. Can you tell us a little about how the organizing drive was able to convince a majority of your coworkers that unionization was in their best interest?
That wasn't ultimately my goal. I can only speak from personal experience, and the conversations I had with my coworkers in terms of unionizing our location wasn't about why I thought they should do it. It was about why I was doing it. I have a long-standing history and tenure with the company, and I've seen a lot of changes happen within that company. And the most apparent one was that we had no control over when benefits were granted or when benefits were taken away. And I saw that happen a lot in over the decade I'd been with the company. So one of the things I talked about them with was that I wanted a way to hold the company accountable. That some of the benefits that Starbucks offers are wonderful, but there's nothing preventing them from coming back tomorrow and taking those benefits away. So we had a lot of conversations about what a collective bargaining agreement could do for us in terms of ensuring that those benefits that the company offered remained those benefits.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pierce, in your testimony, you mentioned the need to reform the NLRA in response to rulings by the NLRB and the courts, which have thwarted congressional intent behind the act. Can you talk a little bit about that and describe potential legislative solutions to this issue?
I'm sorry, Congresswoman, the court case that you're referencing?
I don't have that in front of me, but I think you did mention the need to reform the NLRA.
Oh, yes. Well, certainly the NLRA needs to be reformed in several different respects. In particularly, with respect to the coverage of immigrant workers. The Hoffman Plastics case with the Supreme Court denies immigrant workers, the undocumented workers, the ability to get damages as a result of unfair labor practices. So employers get off completely scot-free because of that. The NLRA needs to be amended for the purposes of providing sanctions for employers, even if these individuals are not able to gain their remedies. The employer needs to have sanctions imposed on them because of the wrongdoings that they engaged in.
Thank you, sir. And Dr. Bronfenbrenner, in your testimony, you evaluate trends in employers' anti-union campaigns going as far back as 1999. And in July of this year, the NLRB announced that its field office staff is half of what it was in 2022. Given the changes you've identified in employer tactics and delays in bargaining and shifts in organizing strategies, what role do you think, if any, the underfunding of the NLRB has played in these trends?
One thing I need to point out is the employer opposition begins well before the petition is filed. In my research, I found that I did a review of unfair labor practices looking at the date they occurred. I did this in 2014 for the NLRB timing changes, and found that in 75% of serious unfair labor practices occurred, I mean, I should say 75% occurred well before the petition is filed, and that employers are, when employers say they don't have a chance to speak, they do. So delay is happening. Delay has this effect of having repeated, continuous, cumulative effects on workers. And when the NLRB is understaffed, that means a longer time for workers to feel the pressure of employer opposition. And the impact in terms of fear and intimidation and coercion, and the inability of the NLRB to investigate hearings because they're investigate charges because they're understaffed. So the impact is pervasive and continuous when the NLRB is understaffed, because the longer time goes on, the more likely there's to be turnover, the more likely workers are to give up and feel the futility of organizing, and the more likely they are to be disciplined or discharged in retaliation for organizing.
Thank you. My time has expired and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Wisconsin. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question for Mr. King. One of the things that I've been kind of confused by, and I think I know there's alternative motives behind it, and that's the mandatory meetings that employers are allowed by law to hold, to have these open discussions with employees about, could be anything from dress code to work hours to anything that they want to have. Yet there seems to be this resistance sometimes from the union to not only allowing those meetings to happen, but also to allow them to kind of play out. It's kind of a control piece that I think is part of the overall discussion. And I was wondering if you could just discuss kind of the legal aspects of the employer requiring those mandatory meetings of its employees.
Mr. Fitzgerald, first, Section 8C of the National Labor Relations Act, the free speech provision, permits employers to have those types of meetings. Second, there is a prohibition, well-established, or prohibitions in the National Labor Relations Act that employers in these meetings can't threaten, coerce, or make undue types of pressure on an employee regarding his or her views on unionization. So we already have those protections. What this is really all about is to cut off free speech. Why is it so dangerous for a worker to hear both sides or many sides of the aspects of unionization? Unions don't want these kinds of conversations to occur because in some instances, they can be very harmful to the union's campaign. They want the worker to hear only one side. And we've heard a lot about the Starbucks meetings. Well, apparently they weren't successful in certain locations. So if they're that harmful, show us the proof. I don't think it's there. This is really a very active part of a campaign throughout the PRO Act and other ways in the executive agencies to ultimately cut off free speech and communication. It's very dangerous.
And just to follow up, and I don't want to single out Starbucks, but I know that we have the witness here today, and I appreciate you being here. But my other concern is that oftentimes it's assumed and it's integrated into the overall model that they're using, that somebody would start at the bottom and work their way up to be kind of in that management level. And then to somehow stifle that individual by saying you can no longer have the same relationship you had with the workers that you're now supervising doesn't make much sense to me. But it seems that that's the case in many of these instances. Is that correct?
Well, it appears to be. And it's really interesting, Ms. Fitzgerald. We have this all at attack, primarily in small business right now, the franchisee, stores like Starbucks that are all over the country. a lot of part-time workers, people that need additional income. It's a great part of our business model in this country. Now, is every Starbucks location, every small employer perfect? No. Are there mistakes being made? There may have been. But why are we going after this so successful business model in this country? When I visit Starbucks stores, as I said in my testimony at the outset, the employees are friendly, efficient, they do a great job. I love their oatmeal, we love their coffee. Why are we attacking such a successful business model in this country? If people want to unionize, they have a right to do so. I'm not here to say anything bad about unions per se, but let's give the worker the right, and let's don't publicly shame companies for being successful.
Yeah, it's part of this conversation that I find somewhat confusing, so thank you very much. I yield back, Chair.
Thank you. And the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro. If he's not available, Mr. Simplesky from New York.
Thank you,
Is he
Mr.
with us?
Thank you,
Good,
Mr. Chairman.
good.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, and welcome to the committee.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you to yourself and the ranking member who's so gracious to me last night. Thank you. I want to also thank the witnesses for being here. I don't represent the city of Buffalo, but I do represent a good portion of Western New York. So thank you for taking the time to come to Washington, D.C. Ms. Bronfenbrenner is coming from the 23rd District of New York. She's one of my constituents, at least as of almost 24 hours. So thank you for taking part. I represent Cornell University. But my question is directed to Mr. King, who is also a Cornell alum, is my understanding. So that's right. You're an honorary constituent. We'll put that there. I want to thank you also for coming today. Okay. My main concern when it comes to these issues is freedom of choice. I think it's important that people have a choice to join a labor union. But I think it's important to have a choice not to join a labor union, have a choice who represents them, make sure that's free from intimidation and manipulation. The experiences that I've had personally with it, when I was a graduate student, there was a movement to unionize that graduate department. I didn't feel we needed a union. I wasn't on board with that. I thought we had a pretty good gig. And I got the smallest dose you could have of intimidation. So we got a loose connection with the mic, but.
Mr. Chairman, perhaps we could move Mr. Semelinsky and stop the clock since there's so much difficulty with his microphone.
No problem. We'll just extend this time if necessary.
Thank the majority for letting me borrow a microphone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Much better.
And hold the clock for a couple of seconds so we can kind of catch up and then proceed. Gentlemen, will proceed.
All right. Well, I had the smallest dose of potential intimidation in the graduate student setting. These were not people I had to work with every day. You're in a very independent work environment where you're sort of working on your own projects. So I know I'm the last Republican to speak on these issues, and I think everything's been probably well covered over this long afternoon for you all. But can you summarize for us why it is so important that people have a free, open, and clear choice? Why is choice so important when a worker is in a position where they're deciding to unionize or not unionize?
First of all, congratulations on being sworn in last night, and welcome to this great body.
Thank you.
It's critical because your work life encompasses so much of everything that you're about. It has impact on your family, your economic well-being, and virtually anything you do often revolves around your workplace. Workers need to have the ability to listen to all sides of the issue of unionization. And I'm not here to condone rogue activity by any employer, certainly not by any union. And if an employee, a group of employees wishes to organize, they should have that opportunity. But the National Labor Relations Board needs to stay exactly neutral, does not take a side, should not take a side at all, procedurally or otherwise, and that workers should be able to hear every aspect. They should be able to hear from their employer. They should have the ability to understand the consequences. And if a union is voted in, as I've said previously today, that union, for all intents and purposes practically, will be there for the life of that company's existence at that particular location. And that's a serious decision because there are many studies that have been made, but 80 to 90% of the workers in this country that are working under a union contract never had an opportunity, Congressman, to vote on whether that union should be there. They have never had a choice, and they won't have a choice. So if you bring a union into a place of employment, it has long-range consequences, not only on the current workers, but on the workforces to come in the future. And it has consequences on potential strikes. We've been talking about potential railway strike and how it could harm this country. It has consequences on your advancement. It has consequences on all kinds of aspects of your employee benefits. So it's a very serious decision, one that should be made under very controlled, neutral circumstances. The secret ballot vote has to be preserved.
Well, you anticipated my second question. So would you definitively say a secret ballot is better at preserving choice than either a card check system or an online system?
I think in our democracy here in this country, compared to the rest of the world, the secret ballot approach to deciding representation, to deciding many important questions, local, state, and federal, are best preserved by the secret ballot process. And why we are thinking of doing away with that is a very poor policy approach.
Thank you very much. I yield.
Thank you. Does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition?
Yes.
Yes, the gentleman's
Chairman.
recognized for 5 minutes. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank everyone for being here. Ms. Eisen, yesterday, the New York Times reported that one of your fellow organizer, Jazz Brizak, was pushed out of her job by Starbucks. Can you explain what happened and what tactics Starbucks is using?
Absolutely. Jazz was victim of a tactic that the company has been using all along, which is to purge the either unionized stores or stores who are planning to organize of the strongest union supporters. Jazz was integral in organizing the first Starbucks store in the US, a coworker of mine. But she also stood for those workers and used her voice to let the company know that what they were doing was wrong and inappropriate. And as we've seen, I mentioned in my spoken testimony, Starbucks has fired over 100 union leaders and supporters to date. And Jazz is just another one in the long line of those. What we saw was a lot of promises leading up to that vote, and when we actually did win, then we started seeing the results of that, which were increased discipline and firings and store closures. That is to say that just because you fight and win your vote does not all of a sudden mean that the company stops their retaliatory actions. In fact, at Elmwood, we've actually seen more retaliation since winning our vote than we did leading up to that vote. And the only thing that can protect us would be labor law reform and continuing to fund the NLRB so that the agency has the resources to investigate these allegations.
I thank you very much. And with that, I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Fox.
I have a question to Mr. King. As you mentioned, California's AB5 proved to be a disaster and is now riddled with exemptions. Yet, DC Democrats are trying their best to make this a national law. Following these policies is guaranteed to cause more harm to workers at the national level. Millions of Americans prefer the independent contractor model and want the flexibility it provides. Why are Democrats in California and DC pushing so hard for an ABC test? Why are they ignoring the needs of those who want to be independent contractors?
Well, first of all, as you correctly mentioned, the citizens of California had the intelligence and forethought to say no to this very radical proposal. And it's interesting to me that members of Congress from California still voted for the PRO Act. That is a contradiction in and of itself. But the specific answer to your question is, if a worker is classified as an independent contractor, the union then cannot organize, cannot unionize that type of workforce. And this is a push to make every worker an employee. I mean, it's simple as that. And it's really interesting to me how much attention and time the union movement is spending in this area when perhaps they ought to devote their resources and attention to the clearly agreed upon employee workforce in this country. And as I say in my testimony, the amount of resources and the amount of activity that unions are spending for all agreed upon employees is very minimal in this country. I don't understand it. I don't think it's a good use of their resources, but they can do as they wish. But I agree with your question. The PRO Act would incorporate this very ill-advised approach.
Thank you. And my next question is, my constituents want transparency. In December, President Biden rescinded the rule that subjected union strike funds, apprenticeship programs, and other trusts to stricter transparency requirements. These funds come from employees' paychecks. Do you feel the unions should ensure they are fully transparent with the dues taken from wages earned by workers, and have union funds been misused?
Well, apprenticeship programs and training, they are critical for economic development in this country, and there should be total transparency. There ought to be safeguards where there's no improper pressure on people going through the apprentice programs to become union members. There should be verified and independent sources of training. Employers ought to have, in my opinion, a greater role in these apprenticeship programs. And we'll see what the Department of Labor does here. I know there's been a recent discussion about this, and hopefully Secretary Walsh and his team will make sure that monies are spent properly and that there is no undue pressure or influence, whether it be by construction unions or other outsiders, to interfere with the apprenticeship program.
Mr. King, my last question is, we are seeing the threat of work stoppage at West Coast ports and now within the freight rail industry. Even small work stoppage can add fuel to the unprecedented supply chain crisis. Congress could vote in coming days to keep rail workers on the job. With how vital our West Coast ports have become, should ports be included in the same rules that railroad and airline employees were under? Because I introduced that bill and it never got out of the Transportation Committee. And I'm very much frustrated about that during this negotiation.
Well, please keep those efforts up. The data that I have seen is that our West Coast ports are some of the least efficient in the world. And it's very unfortunate because of the adverse impact then that those work rules have on the rest of the economy. So the potential for a port strike, and of course we're all concerned this week about the potential rail strike. Our transportation system in this country is very fragile. and strikes are not the solution. And inappropriate, unproductive work rules have to be changed for the good of the country. Put aside whether you're an employer or union. So I'm hopeful that the negotiations will put aside some of these unproductive work rules and permit more efficiency.
Thank you, Mr. King. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. It's my understanding that there's no further members seeking recognition. If not, I recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purpose of questions. First, let me make a couple of comments to respond to things said about the PRO Act and the fact that everyone would be expected to pay their fair share. All workers would be required to pay their fair share of the expenses in developing the fact that union members make 10% more than non-union members. They get better health care, they get better pensions, safer workplace. Those negotiations and hiring experts cost money, and it's not unreasonable to ask those that will get the benefits and are entitled to the benefits as a matter of law, pay at least their fair share. And we're not talking about their fair share of the political activities or the annual holiday party or the summer cookout, but those benefits that are required by law to be negotiated on their behalf and that they will get. Comments have been made, I think, on the independent contractor. Yeah, there's more freedom in it, and you can't organize unless you're actual employees. But there are other things that independent contractors lose, like unemployment compensation if they lose their job through no fault of their own. Workers' compensation, they don't get workers' compensation if they're injured on the job. Minimum wage, they don't get minimum wage or overtime. The civil rights protection, they don't get the assistance of the EEOC. There are a lot of things that happen when you are classified as an independent contractor. The joint employer, all that's asked there is that the person responsible for the violation, failure to pay overtime, violations of OSHA, the entity responsible for the violation be held accountable for the violation. I've seen bills where the definition of employer is so strict that you can prove that you weren't paid your overtime and you don't have an employer to collect from. It's unclear who the employer is if you got a temp agency and you're working somewhere. So the person who did the violation ought to be responsible. And we've heard comments about the 200 unfair labor practice allegations versus Starbucks. The fact is, these are more than allegations. There have been findings by the regional director and the general counsel that these are valid violations. Now, Mr. King is absolutely right. They haven't been adjudicated. They have to go before an administrative law judge for adjudication. They're subject to appeal, but they're more than just the labor unions making the allegations. These have been actual findings in these 200 cases. So let me ask Ms. Bronfenbrenner, we've heard that the small percentage of people in labor unions today is a result of them choosing not to join a union. Is that the right conclusion to make?
If you were to say that you were, facing threats that you were voluntarily choosing, then that is not a choice. Workers who try to organize today have to jump through repeated hoops of fire in order to organize. They have to overcome the intimidation. They have to overcome fear of job loss, the interrogation, surveillance. And so they are not organizing freely. And we know that when there is no employer opposition, as I found in 13% of the campaigns in my current sample, the win rate is above 86%. We know in the public sector, where there's much less employer opposition, win rates average above 85%. So when workers can choose without coercion, without threats, without intimidation, the numbers go way up. Unfortunately, we don't live in that climate because we have such weak and poorly enforced labor laws, because there are no financial penalties for employers, while there are high financial penalties for unions. And where employers are literally able to get away with breaking the law on a daily basis.
Thank you. Mr. Pierce, your initial testimony was cut off. Were there any points that you weren't able to make?
What I did want to talk about is Amazon. When Bessemer was decided, and it initially looked like they lost 2-1, and I was approached about the death knell of unions, I said, well, the difference in this situation and what you're described is that when you have a union that is able to go into the South in a right-to-work state before a company that has more money than God, that can control traffic lights and mailboxes, it's not a death knell for the union. It is a shot across the bow. And you saw that was the case because in Staten Island, they won decisively, and in Bessemer, the battle is still not over.
Thank you. Thank you. My time has expired. Pursuant to committee practice, materials for submission to the hearing record must be submitted to the committee clerk within 14 days following the last day of the hearing, which is close of business September 28th, preferably in Microsoft Word format. Only a member of the committee or invited witness may submit materials for inclusion in the hearing record, and materials must address the subject matter of the hearing. Please submit materials to the clerk electronically by emailing submissions to edenlabor.hearings@mail.house.gov. Again, I want to thank our witnesses for participation today. Members of the committee may have additional questions, and we ask the witnesses to respond to those questions in writing. The hearing record will be held open for 14 days in order to receive those responses. Now, remind colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, witness questions for the hearing must be submitted to the majority committee staff or committee clerk within 7 days. Questions submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member for a closing statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I give my closing remarks, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a myth fact sheet rebutting many of the statements made by Democrats today. I also ask to enter letters from the Coalition for a Democratic Workplace, the National Association of Home Builders, the National Restaurant Association, and the Independent Electrical Contractors, raising serious concerns with the PRO Act and with recent actions and policies pursued by the NLRB and its General Counsel. I further ask to enter in the record a letter from Starbucks Corporation to the NLRB detailing alleged misconduct by NLRB employees in union representation elections. Finally, I ask to enter in the record several pleadings from Starbucks litigation with the NLRB.
Is there any objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the witnesses for participating in today's hearings. Ensuring workers can make a free and informed decision about unionization should be a priority on both sides of the aisle. But my Democrat colleagues' sole objective seems to be to force union representation on workers and increase union membership, even though, as we have heard today, the majority of workers have little interest in joining a union. Democrats and union activists claim there's a historic surge in union organizing, yet private sector union membership is at an all-time low. Unions are quick to blame external factors for declining membership, but they need to look in the mirror. Most labor unions devote little resources on retaining and recruiting new members. Instead, big labor gives priority to funding left-wing advocacy groups and lobbying Democrats to enact legislation that forces unions on unwilling workers. While they currently have an ally in the White House who's willing to mobilize all federal agencies in his crusade to force as many workers into unions as possible, that will not always be the case. Democrats should work with Republicans to promote pro-growth and pro-opportunity policies that work for a 21st century economy rather than the PRO Act, which is an assault on worker freedom and would devastate the economy. Again, I'd like to thank our witnesses for taking time to join us today, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for the purpose of making my closing statement. I want to thank our witnesses for your time and testimony. Comments have been made about the pending rail strike. I just want to say that we all hope that the issues can be resolved before the deadline, especially the paid sick leave issues. No one benefits with a strike, particularly the workers involved themselves. Joining a union, as I indicated in my opening statement, should be a right, not a fight. Unfortunately, despite record popularity and high-profile victories, workers are facing unprecedented anti-union campaigns. As our witnesses made clear, decades of GOP and corporate attacks have rendered the National Labor Relations Act toothless, allowing unscrupulous employers to intimidate and retaliate against their workers virtually without recourse. In response, House Democrats and 5 House Republicans passed the Protecting the Right to Organize, or the PRO Act, which would address weaknesses in the NLRA and strengthen workers' rights. Regrettably, the Senate has failed to act. While the House Labor Age Appropriations Bill would increase the NLRB's appropriations by $45 million and ameliorate almost a decade of flat funding, it is imperative that Congress actually enact this increase. We're serious about giving workers the tools that they need to succeed in the modern economy. The Senate must pass the PRO Act and fully fund the NLRB to ensure that workers can collectively bargain for higher wages, better benefits, and safer workplaces. Before we end, I want to recognize 2 outgoing committee members who have championed rights that we've discussed today. Congressman Levin of Michigan and Congressman Jones of New York worked hard to support working families throughout their time on this committee, where they both demonstrated principled leadership to strengthen the right to organize and pass the PRO Act. Congressman Levin provided valuable insight and amendments to strengthen the PRO Act, bringing attention to organizing campaigns across the country and introducing groundbreaking legislation to protect the integrity of union representation elections by allowing safe electronic voting. He also brought his experience as in job training to the committee, which was very valuable as we worked on many job training and bills and legislation. Just recently, Congressman Jones successfully offered an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act that seeks to crack down on contracting with those employers who engage in unfair labor practices in the last 3 years. So I want to thank both Congressman Levin and Congressman Jones for their leadership on behalf of the American people.
Mr. Chairman.
Is there any further business? The gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With your indulgence, I'd like to recognize the departing Republican members of the committee, since you have done so for the Democrat departing members.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The departing members, Republican members of the committee, are Mr. Keller of Pennsylvania, the ranking member of the Workforce Protection Subcommittee, who has done a fantastic job of bringing his experiences in the real world to this committee. Mr. Cawthorn of North Carolina, my colleague, and Mr. Jacobs of New York. I thank all of them for their contributions to the committee, and they will be sorely missed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And we want to congratulate all of our retiring members for their great work on the committee and great contributions. Is there any further business to come before the committee? If not, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.